You're live, Your Worship.
All right, thank you very much, Madam Clerk. Welcome members of council to a special council meeting workshop that's being held here on Thursday, November the 25th, 2021. It's a little after 2:30 p.m. We're going to get started. This is a specific workshop in regards to the Indigenous land acknowledgement that we have been working on here at the Township of Clearview. And so that's the focus of the entire meeting at this time. And we do have some official business to do. We have a couple of guests that have joined us here, and we're very much looking forward to this great session. So let me move on with our official part, and then we'll go directly to our workshop session. Members of council, the approval of the agenda recommendation be it resolved that council of the Township of Clearview hereby approve the special meeting agenda dated November 25, 2021 as presented. Mover and seconder on the motion, please. Mr. Broderick and Mr. Walker, any questions? Seeing none, I'll call the motion. All those in favor? And that motion carries. Thank you. And council, disclosure of pecuniary interest and general nature thereof. Is there any disclosure of pecuniary interest regarding this issue or this question, this workshop? If anything comes up, please bring it forward at this time and we will deal with it right away as per our procedure. All right, so members of council, item 3 on our agenda is the Indigenous Land Acknowledgement Education Session. And as I said, this is the focus of this workshop. Very happy that we're finally here to do this. I want to acknowledge the members of the public that reached out to us in a, basically it was part of public participation period, as well as letters that we received from members of the public that asked us about this issue in our township and whether this is something that our community asks of us to do as a council. And further, I want to acknowledge the clerk's department, who has worked very diligently to investigate both our municipal responsibilities through our role in the Municipal Act, as well as the responsibilities we have as a community. And as a clerk's department, I want to point out that they're being very open and interested in hearing from our community on this very issue. So we have a wonderful asset in our staff by the name of Kayla Reimer, who does a lot of work with all of our volunteer groups. And so certainly someone who knows a lot about meetings is Kayla Reimer. So we're very happy that Kayla is here to lead our workshop session council. I don't think there's anybody finer to do that as far as meetings, leading the meetings, because she's demonstrated over and over again how many times she can keep our volunteers in line. So thank you for help keeping them in order. And that's what's important. So Kayla, I want to appreciate you, first of all, for all the work you've done to put this together. I'm going to turn the entire meeting over to Kayla, who's then going to conduct the workshop. And I'm here, of course, to assist at any time, Kayla, if you need. So members of council and members of our staff and members of the public that are watching, I'll just throw it right over to Kayla Reimer. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. And good afternoon, Mayor Measures, council and staff. On September 13th, 2021, report LS-11-2021 entitled Indigenous Land Acknowledgement was presented to council with a recommendation to host an educational session in relation to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action and to provide additional information and context to assist council in moving forward with creating and adapting a township land acknowledgement. Today's educational session will focus on Indigenous law and restorative justice, which will be presented by Jennifer Summerfield, an elementary school teacher with the Simcoe County District School Board, who's an Indigenous mentor for the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario. Certified in restorative justice and past work experience with the Barrie Native Friendship Center as a Wasanabin worker, Jennifer is committed to improving First Nations, Inuit, and Métis education in public system and actively promotes the First Nation, Inuit, and Métis perspective in her teachings. Jennifer is an Anishinaabe woman from Lac Seul First Nation, which is in Treaty 3. Today's session will begin with the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Aboriginal Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, and Aboriginal Crown relations, presented by Dr. Cynthia Wesley Eskimo, who served Vice Provost for the Indigenous Initiatives at Lakehead University, was appointed the first Indigenous Chair for the Truth and Reconciliation in Canada, and is responsible for the development and implementation on the President's Council on the Truth and Reconciliation at Lakehead University. Her teachings and academic writing is directed towards understanding historic and intergenerational trauma and unresolved grief within the Indigenous community. She held the Nexon Chair for Indigenous Leadership at the Banff Centre in Alberta for 4 years and remains a faculty member in the Indigenous Learning Program. She was appointed as an honorary witness by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and chairs the governing circle at the Centre for Truth and Reconciliation at the University of Manitoba. Cynthia also chairs the nonprofit teachforcanada.ca, which recruits and trains certified teachers for remote First Nations. She's a member of the Chippewa of Georgina Island First Nation in Lake Simcoe and has dedicated her life to building bridges of understanding and sees endless merit in bringing people from diverse cultures, ages, and backgrounds together to engage in practical dialogue. She's deeply committed to public education and active youth engagement and co-founded the Canadian Roots Exchange at the University of Toronto, Lakehead, and Saskatchewan. Please welcome Dr. Cynthia Wesley Eskimo.
Okay, thank you. That's a lot. Makes me feel tired already. So, all right, it's good to see everybody here. And thank you so much for this opportunity. I know it's challenging to do this kind of a session online so that you can't really, I'm going to get rid of myself here. There we go. So that so we can't really engage on a personal level. But I'm going to try to give you a really concise overview of all of the kinds of things that are happening, all of the kinds of things that are important to the Indigenous community across Canada. I'll try to get the United Nations Declaration in there. I heard her say that, and all the other pieces. Let me just say this to you: it is a very big conversation. And these are courses that get taught over the over an entire year. So we're going to try to squeeze all that into an hour, a little over an hour to allow you some time to ask questions. And I've embedded in the slides that I'm going to use an opportunity for you to ask questions or to pop things into your chat. So if you have a question, please don't feel uncomfortable asking me to stop. If I'm speaking too quickly or I wasn't clear, please feel like it's okay for you to come, to say, could you just, do something, reiterate that, and I will do that. I don't know what else I can tell you about myself other than that. I think we're all very busy trying to get through this thing. I will be showing you one video on land acknowledgements. I will talk a little bit about land acknowledgements, but really what I'm more interested in teaching you about is what's behind those land acknowledgements. Where did those things come from? Why are we even having this discussion? So that's what's really important here, I think. So I'm going to try to get around to that. Question me if you need to. Let me see if I can share my screen. Yeah, I can. Okay, so I'm going to go to the slides, and then I think I can see you, but if not, Kayla, you can stop and ask me to stop, and I will do so.
Okay.
Okay, but images are always really helpful when we're doing this kind of thing, so that you can actually see the kinds of conversations that we're having. So I'm calling it indigenizing the conversation. I will talk a little bit about decolonization, which is some of the language that is being utilized across the country right now. I have a tendency to go with the indigenizing piece because to me, decolonizing means taking down the entire country and every corporation and institution across it. And frankly, I don't have the energy for that. But I do have the energy to actually bring the indigenizing process into places like academic institutions. We're doing board work with EDI, and we're doing a lot of different kinds of things to help people come to some conclusions on what's going to be important as we move into this next decade. So this is what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, some of the foundations of those historic realities, what happened first, and I'll pop along as we go. Some of the legacy pieces of colonialism in this country. I'm going to talk about cultural intelligence, humility, and safety. I want to talk a little bit about what are the kinds of things that we're asking for people to think about so that we can move into a more collaborative relationship, and a little bit about EDI and relations. And then it's all kind of in a nutshell, and building models of health and understanding what TwoWhite Seeing means. How do we walk so that we have our own vision, but we also understand that there's other worldviews that also impact the way we see the world. And how do we do that? And then just some principles of engagement and trust building and things like that. So a little bit of this, a little bit of that, to try to give you a sense of how big this conversation is. And one of the things I want to know is, what do you already know? I mean, it's not like you guys don't have any knowledge at all about Indigenous peoples. some of you have had some education in your schools. I know that when I was going to school, it wasn't very helpful because most of it was about the Indians killing the settlers, and there once upon a time, and we had spaghetti westerns when I was growing up, and it was all about the good guys and the bad guys. And so those things have actually changed, and I think your children and grandchildren are getting a very different kind of an education today. So if you feel like it, just pop things into the chat, and I'll try to address them as we go along. I know you know something about this. The question is, can I enhance that learning somewhat so that you have a better sense of how we got to where we are and why we're having this conversation? The other piece is just sort of saying, I know you've probably done some reading, and I know you've probably been in some places, but sometimes it's about embracing a very different kind of a narrative. It's about actually going to places where you wouldn't normally go. We invite people all the time to come into powwow situations, to read books by Indigenous peoples, and I will give Kayla a book list, I think I already did, that has a significant number of books that have been written by Indigenous peoples from their perspective, which gives you a different kind of a take on the history that we're all looking at and learning about across Canada. So it's just kind of saying, I'll reframe that, or I'll bracket the knowledge space that I have, especially, the biases and beliefs, and allow some additional or different kinds of information to come into the world. And some of those books, by the way, are written by elders. They're written by healers and teachers who have worked collaboratively with an academic or somebody like that to actually put down the teachings and the histories in their very own words, so that we can actually see them, because they didn't want to see them get lost. So this is the original agreements. These are some of the original agreements that were made at, fairly, not immediately after contact, but fairly recently after contact. And they're important because they're still very viable. They're still active in Canada. Canada still recognizes these treaties. These are the original ones, the numbered treaties, which were done in the 1800s. And of course, the peace and friendship treaties that were done on the East Coast are very much a part of the conversations that are going on with the lobster fisheries and the battles that are happening over there with the, who should be able to commercial fish lobster and who should not, how many traps are viable, what does earning a moderate income actually mean? The court said yes, that Indigenous peoples can actually engage in commercial fishery, but they did not say, what the limitations were. And so that's at issue right now. And of course, there are what we call pre-Confederation treaties. Ontario has the distinction of having the earliest treaties and the most recent treaties in Ontario. So those, and then on this particular map, that Williams Treaty map, that one that's all in red there, is significant because it was just resolved, even though it was 1923, which is a fairly recent treaty. It was resolved in 2018, and at that time, it was the largest treaty settlement in Canada at $1.1 billion. And I had worked on that land claim over the course of time and understood it to be a very complex and complicated dialogue because of what had happened. Initially, in 1923, the bands that were associated to that claim were offered, or actually were settled with just under $1 million. And they took all of that land, which is the Muskokas, all the way down to the townships in Toronto and York, which were at the time were valued at incalculable. So, when we came back to it, it actually changed the whole dynamic of that particular claim, and it was settled, which is a good thing, and it actually benefits the entire region for everyone. Everything that happens across this country when it comes to these land claim settlements benefits everybody. So these are the original ones. This is what it looks like today. So now we have Nunavut that was settled in 1993. We have the James Bay Northern Cree, Quebec settlement. We have the Nunavut. So we have all of the things that are going on in the north, in the territories. We have lots of things happening in BC. Seashell was one of the first land claim settlement or modern day treaties that was signed. And I've already talked to the Williams Treaty. So it's changed the landscape. Underneath all of this, as far as the courts are concerned, there is Indigenous title, underlying Indigenous title, and it has meaning. And there's lots of things we can say about this. If we were doing it solely on this particular area on treaties, we would also talk about what do those land claims mean, what are third party interests about, and all the other pieces that go along with it. But suffice to say, the landscape is changing. All of these treaties will eventually have modern day self-government agreements associated to them. And at some point, they may well affect the territories where you live. Right now, you know, they're there and they're being resolved, but nobody gets kicked out of any places. You know, it's not like, oh, we settled this land claim, you all have to leave. It's not like that. It just means that there's a willing buyer, willing seller piece put in place. Maybe lands will be go under the additions to reserves lands policies, and there's other things that happen. But otherwise, it also means that Indigenous communities can actually create economy. That is the most important thing, and education, and all of those pieces. And so, you know, we don't have a bank of Georgina Island where I'm from. The money, when the land claim is settled, goes into the banks in Sutton and Newmarket. We buy our cars there, we go to hotels. So the money goes right back out into the Canadian economy. It is not about the Indians now have money, nobody else does. It actually gets distributed almost immediately into the economy. So it's a very interesting dialogue that I think we should know a little bit more about as we go forward. Lots of people ask me, what is a treaty? So we're like, oh yeah, these are the agreements that were made when settlement occurred in this country and in the United States. This is how many treaties are recognized, but there are actually literally hundreds. These are some of the key treaties. In BC, they often say they have no treaties, but on Vancouver Island, the Douglas treaties were actually drafted, and you know, of course, there's the numbered and the Robinson Superior, Robinson Huron, which they now took the Robinson off and just call them the Huron Superior treaties. And the Huron and Superior treaties are actually now engaged in a conversation with the courts on modernizing the treaty payments, which at one time were like $5 a head. And they're now quantifying them in a modern, giving them modern expression. So that's going to be a very interesting case when that is actually resolved. We don't know what that will look like, but that is going through the courts now. So it's really interesting. And of course, the peace and neutrality treaties, I think, were really important as well, because it really was the foundation of the relationship that Indigenous peoples wanted to have with settlement, that there would be peace and friendship. And the two-row wampum, which I don't have copies for in this particular slide deck, have the 2 rows, and people often talk about those 2 rows as having the most importance, because you have your ships and we have our canoes and we have our own governance systems and we have our own laws and we have everything else, and they shall never interfere. Of course they have, but the other important piece about that is the white wampums, which are about peace, friendship, and respect. So the foundations of this country were actually forged in friendship. And it is something that we'd all very much like to return to, as long as there's resolution of historic grievance. So there's lots of things about that that are very important. Whoops, I went the wrong way there. So you're talking about doing a land acknowledgement, and I think it is a very important piece of the conversation. But I really, you know, caution people about doing land acknowledgements just for the sake of doing a land acknowledgement. You know, there really needs to be some understanding behind it. There really needs to be some understanding of what that connection to the land actually means, and how this land acknowledgement is going to represent the impacts of climate change on everybody. So it is about acknowledging the fact that there were Indigenous peoples that lived on this land prior to occupation and settlement, but it's also saying we all need to take very seriously and deeply into consideration the fact that this land is being abused, and we're seeing the impact now through extreme weather events and all of the things. BC has really struggled over the last month with all of the impacts, and they're still struggling. So, you know, we have to ask ourselves about that inheritance, and how do we challenge policy and practice now that is actually very much a part of this particular conversation. So these are really important considerations. So the land acknowledgements are important. I want to come out of here just for a minute. I want to share a little video with you if I can. I'm not sure if I can. How do we do that? Well, let me see if I can share my screen now. Okay, let me just come back out and go back in again. I want to show a video to you if I can. Let's see if it'll go. Can you see that? Yes? Perfect.
Yes.
Okay, I just want to share this with you because I think it's really interesting. It was just sent to me not too long ago.
Hello. Hello. First, I'd like to remind everyone here to turn off your cell phones. Before we begin this evening's performance, we would like to acknowledge that this theater stands on territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Petun First Nations. We are also mindful of broken covenants and the need to make right with all our relations. And now, please enjoy the show.
Sorry, hello? Excuse me, should we go?
Excuse me?
Oh, no, I just mean if we're on someone else's land, shouldn't we leave?
Oh, no. The theater is here now. We'd just like to acknowledge whose land it is.
I'm sorry, I'm so confused. So if we're on someone else's land, shouldn't we do something about that? Or
hopefully we'll enjoy the performance.
oh, okay, so some of the money from the ticket sales of the show are going to the Indigenous communities?
Well, no.
A portion of them?
No, the ticket sales go to the theater.
So is the money from the bottled water sold here going to the First Nations for clean drinking water? Or?
Oh no, that money goes to Nestle. They're a sponsor.
I'm so sorry. I'm so confused. So whose land are we on? What are we doing?
It's a dialogue.
How are we making right?
Well, there's a plaque you can read in the lobby.
I don't understand.
I'm getting a message from the stage manager that we need to begin the show, so please take your seats. Have a good time. Good night.
So sit down. Enjoy the show. Just enjoy the show.
So you can see the, it's one thing to certainly to have the land acknowledgement, but what follows the land acknowledgement is the question. So I thought that was an interesting little dialogue for us to give some thought onto, because I've been in lots of places there's different people that have now produced various kinds of plays around just solely on land acknowledgements. So, it's an interesting question. So a land acknowledgement is important as long as there's some action that actually is associated to it. So that's going to be important. And this is really the action that you're taking here today that is, I think, important, is actually doing the learning behind it. So I'll give you a short historical summary of the need for this particular conversation and why we're having it. And I'll go through different things to actually highlight those. But the legacy effects are things that come out of that pre and post contact. The epidemics, we know now as anthropologists, something like, 100, well, like if there's 12 million or 120 million people continentally, we know that within 150 years, something like 80% of that population was wiped out because of epidemics and diseases like we're experiencing with this pandemic that we're currently in. There was a lot of displacement from traditional territories. The doctrine of discovery, terra nullius, manifest destiny were the kinds of phrases that were utilized at one point to actually remove Indigenous peoples from their lands and settle them. There are more modern kinds of conversations that went on, and certainly the number of treaties are part of that. The residential school institutions, Indian hospitals that came out of that because they didn't want Indians in regular hospitals. And also there was a real problem with tuberculosis. The day school period, which is now being settled, the money is now going out to people from across Canada that went to day schools, which had similar kinds of issues as the residential schools. The missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, men, boys, the numbers are getting higher and higher. We're now into probably 4,000 or 5,000, and it's still being debated as to how we will fulfill the, I think it's well over 300 recommendations for action on that, and I don't know how many of them have been fulfilled. The child welfare invasion, I'm going to talk a little bit about as we go through, because it has had a tremendous impact on everything that we're doing and everything we're talking about, including the Human Rights Commission cases that have come forward with about discrimination of the federal government against Indigenous children, and all of the Canadian associations for child protection that have actually created more problems since the residential schools closed. And of course, now we're looking at the recovery of missing children and unmarked graves. And that is one of the things that I think has actually created enough more of the conversations around what we're doing now. We had lots of Indigenous people talk about children dying in these schools. And we knew already that somewhere around 50% of the children that went into these schools actually died at the schools or died shortly thereafter. We're aware that some of them died running away. Some of them died when they got home from tuberculosis and other disorders. So we know that there was a lot of death that was associated with these schools, and the recovery of these unmarked graves, and it's now also heading into the thousands. So we're working on trying to match those and try to, work with the grief that Indigenous communities are experiencing again. Like it's like a re-traumatization process that seems to happen over and over again. So we're trying to deal with that and help people move through that in as good a way as possible. So these are some of the things that we have to look at. And this particular map comes out of a book called In Plain Sight by Mary Ellen Trappell, and it was actually issued just this year, but it really speaks very effectively to some of the issues that happened. There were Indigenous systems in place, there were governance, justice, educational systems in place prior to contact. We have lots of ample evidence about that. The colonialism process affected the healthcare systems, which of course were the Indian hospitals that generated a lot of the stereotypes that we're currently dealing with. And of course the comments and conversations I'm sure you're aware of the Joyce Echaquan incident in Quebec and the Brian Sinclair events in Winnipeg, and there are many others that could be put into that same basket. Where people are not treated properly because of the stereotypes that are associated with Indigenous peoples. And I will tell you this, that my own daughter had that same experience when she gave birth to her daughter in August 2020, when she complained that a guy was walking through her room without a mask on. The nurse took a look at her and saw that she was Indigenous and said, "If you complain, I'll call CAS on you." And my daughter is a director at the University of Ottawa and has a great job and a great education and was married and had a baby, or when she was having a baby, all of those things. And still she was treated as if she was going to be, they would take her child away from her. So that happens. It leads to lots of the issues around inappropriate pain management, medical mistakes that are made, people being sent home when they shouldn't be sent home because people think that they're just drinking or they're drug addicts, and they're not. They're actually in for actual treatment. There are less access, of course, in the north and places like that, excuse me, and there are higher suicidation rates and everything else that go along with that. So the point for us is to actually break the cycle by reclaiming jurisdiction authority over our own health systems, our own educational systems, teaching about cultural safety and humility, and working on an anti-racism program with most places so that people understand, and then re-establishing those systems and knowledge and practices, wise practices, and all of the pieces that make our communities healthy places to live. So the idea is that you learn, recognize where it impacts in your city or your system. You're not in a health system, I know, but you have to deal with one as a city. And there are Indigenous peoples that come into your city, not just sympathizing, but actually doing something about it and getting to know about it. And then, of course, doing the learning that's essential and helping to decolonize your own family. Like, work with the people that you know. And people always say, well, what do I do? It's like, well, learn something and work with the people that you know in the places where you live, in your own church, in your own community. It's the best place way to do it, one-on-one. Understanding some of the truths that the communities themselves are really in a transformative process right now. They are working very hard on breaking those cycles and are creating all kinds of institutions, child welfare laws, education laws. There's a lot going on right across the country. I still remember when I was in BC a couple of years ago, talking to a community who had lost a little girl to care because of the family was having some very serious challenges. And it was a non-Indigenous family. And when the next little girl in the family also had to be taken from the family and sent with her sister, they said, we don't want to lose access to these children. So they adopted the entire non-Indigenous family into their nation, so that family would be a part of the community, would be a part of the events that they had, the ceremonies and everything else. And the children would be raised in conjunction to their families, their relatives, and the community itself. So there are ways of approaching this that the communities are coming up with themselves that are really important. And that is a transformative process. The healthcare systems, I put up a picture of medicine circles, medicine wheels. They're still viable, useful, and used by elders across the country. They have a lot of power in them, and they're all over the world, really. But we still utilize these tools. This is a more ancient one. I'll show you one that is actually more contemporary. And here's an example of why we're talking about children and why it's so important for us to reconstitute our own nations and our own languages and ceremonies and everything else. So many children in care across the country, and these numbers don't even really reflect how dire it is in relation to most of the other people in the province. So maybe 4% of the population in Manitoba is Indigenous, but something like 52% of the children that are in care are Indigenous. So there's some real inequity here that we have to address. And it's a big conversation that's going on across the country. And I'm seeing some successes. I know Cindy Blackstock and her work with the Human Rights Commission. I know that the 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had 5 very specific calls to action on addressing the needs of children and revising or restructuring the CASs and child protection agencies to accommodate Indigenous peoples and what they need. So out of that comes a conversation on cultural safety and how important it is. And cultural safety is associated with health. But I think it's inherent in any relational system, any place where you have people, any place where you have imbalances or class differences or income differences, educational differences. You're going to have some of those problems where you have people that are more advantaged than others. And so I think it's really important that safety is understood to be defined by those receiving the service coming into your offices, the people that you're seeing on a regular basis, that you understand how when they come into your services, many of them are very uncomfortable coming into buildings like a city hall, because it's big and it's imposing and they don't necessarily know what's going on there all the time. It's not true of all Indigenous peoples, of course, but like I'm thinking more about when I was living in Thunder Bay, how challenging it can be for northern communities to access the services they need because they have to enter these buildings to talk to people that they don't know. And many of them are language speakers, Indigenous language speakers, and so they have difficulty actually getting through that. So it's really important that self-awareness and the cultural awareness piece is there so that people coming into your offices feel comfortable being there, and there's some understanding that they're not necessarily going to be as adept at navigating those systems as everybody else. So that's an important part of this cultural safety piece. The principles of that are, of course, the protocols and understanding that that people have different ways of relating and communicating, and we need to understand that. Different forms of engagement, that you have to be mindful of your own personal cultural identity. I think that's a really important piece for everybody, because we had so many conversations with children, and as a former professor, people who've said to me, I wish I was an Indian, and I'm like, why? And they say, well, because you have culture, you have identity, you have things that we don't have. I don't know anything about who I am. My parents have never talked about the history of our family and where they came from, and I thought that's really interesting that they don't have a sense. They may way back in the, they were Italian at some point, or Asian, but they don't speak the language and they don't know the stories. They don't have the worldview. So those are really important things that, our people are very mindful of that and try very hard to ensure that we stay in touch with who we are, and that we teach our children right from the beginning that, as Indigenous peoples, and hopefully language. My daughter speaks the language more than any of us do, but, it's an important part of that. And learning about, checking in and what people prefer and how they need to be spoken to, and it's not about speaking to them slowly necessarily. It's just about actually understanding that, different idioms and language and how people express themselves are really important to try to understand. Building collaborative practices with people that you're engaging with, and even when they're coming before your city council, and actually asking for something to have changed or happen in the city. They may be coming from a cultural community, and it needs to be understood that that's the possibility, and they're not necessarily going to sound just like you. And there's some joint things that can happen there. And then just having positive steps to make sure that this happens. It's so simple, but yet so challenging for people to really understand it. It really is. So we also want to talk about, how do we actually do it? So we've used medicine wheels for a very long time. They're not contiguous to this particular territory. I'm in Aurelia right now in Ontario. Most of the medicine wheel teachings come from out in the prairies, where I was showing you that wheel. But they do help us as teaching tools, because they show us, how balance can be achieved. So on a wheel like this, in the center is ourselves, like, the sacred I that is ourselves and our ways of being and knowing. But then we look at, each of those places hold something for us. So there is the emotional component of our lives and who we are and how do we belong to the places where we live and the people that we belong to. Our ability to learn, like that mental wellness and language and all those pieces that are an important part of who we are and how we express ourselves. Physically staying healthy, getting enough sleep, eating properly, and then that whole spiritual element that sometimes gets forgotten. So these wheels help us to understand how to get to those places, and we use them to teach our kids, and they're very effective tools for anybody. If I left it empty and asked you to fill it out, and what do you do in each of those places? Because it's easy to become imbalanced. It's easy to be far too physical. You got great muscles, but you never pick up a book. You're very emotional. You're always hurting and everything. But you need to reach out to do a little bit of learning about how to manage that. Like there's lots of things about this that are very important. So it's important for you to understand that we quite often use these things in our own world. The violence of benevolence. I have to tell you. Years ago, I was called into Ottawa to go to a conversation with people about, and what they were talking was, how do we fix this? How do we fix Indigenous peoples? How do we fix our relationship? And they were using that language. And I remember being so upset about it, because when they finally got to me, there was a very big circle of people. They asked me what I thought. And I said, I think you just need to get the hell out of the way. And, they were like, it's not very pleasant. And I was like, well, because you're overdoing everything. You're trying to help people to death here. And, you're not allowing people the opportunity to do things for themselves and to understand their own history and how to mitigate the impacts of that and how to move forward in a good way. When the Indian Act was put in place in 1876, it basically said, you don't have to do anything. We'll make all the decisions for you. We'll take care of you. We'll create your housing. We'll create your education systems. We'll create, we'll look after your children, or take your children to take care of them. And it really left these communities bereft. It left them with nothing that they could actually manage on their own. So the Indian Act was, I think somebody said to me, a lawyer one time said, the Mickey Mouse Club has more authority than Indians do under the Indian Act. They have, because they can't make, the only rules that they could make at one time were dogs and garbage. And other than that, the Indian agent was responsible for making those decisions. So you take away decision-making capacity from a people, you end up with a dependency situation that is hard to break. So we're all coming out of that now. I think we've reclaimed a lot of the decision-making capacity. That's what self-government is all about. But it's been a slow process, because there's still a government system that says we have the right to make decisions on your behest. And that's become, it's been a very difficult thing to break away and break out of. So it's important that you understand that there's a history behind people's inability to somehow succeed in education systems that are not designed for their needs, or health systems that reject their presence. It's justice systems that operate solely on their presence. I had a lawyer when I was in Alberta tell me that they had a jail system in a very small city in Alberta. They built a super jail in Edmonton, and they wanted this small jail to send the Indigenous people to the super jail. And the jail, they told them, no, we can't send them to you. We have to keep them. Because if we don't have these people in prison here in this small town, then people will lose their jobs and they won't be able to pay their mortgages. And the one thing we know with Indigenous peoples in jail is that they do their entire time. They don't usually get out early for good behavior for whatever reason, but it's paid for by the government. So it's a guaranteed support for those systems. So it becomes an industry to keep Indigenous peoples in jail. So there's a lot of things about this, the way these systems are set up right now, that are really problematic for Indigenous peoples. And because we have a lot of children going into foster care and adoptive care, when they come out of those care systems, quite often they're aging out into poverty, and quite often they're aging out into poverty and then into jail. So it is a non-ending impact for a lot of our community members. And then if you do go to jail, you often carry the stigma of that for the rest of your life. And it means that you have less likelihood to get the kind of jobs that you want. So there's a lot of things about this that are really important for you to understand. So taking those things away it's not right. It is a societal violence to think you can fix people in their circumstances, when really the only one our whole society system needs to be fixed, not just the Indigenous community. There's lots that's going on that's really important. And then of course there's all those media and gossip and movies and stories that tell you a different kind of a story, and not the whole story of who Indigenous peoples are. So really important. And we talk about cultural intelligence. I know that most people have some sense of emotional intelligence and how emotional intelligence are important. But the cultural intelligence is also just an extension. It's saying, I know you're intelligent, you understand what makes people, but add the cultural component onto that and understand that the impacts that are there for language, certain kinds of behaviors, needs, different kinds of needs. In the North, people need to get off to go hunting. It's not something we do in the South. So how do we understand that? So there's lots of things that are, again, it's a very big conversation around how that works and how it impacts, and it sort of bumps up against modern expressions of society. I think of the questions of culture, confidentiality and transparency as an example when it comes to cultural intelligence. In a remote community, transparency was and is a norm. I mean, you live in a small community, everybody knows who you are, and most people know what's up. If there's an issue, they are aware of it. But because the medical society, biomedical world, and educational world, and other justice worlds have brought in this concept of confidentiality, nobody's supposed to know. So you end up with a situation where there is a serious problem in the community. Everybody knows about it, but nobody's allowed to talk about it because it would breach confidentiality. And then the elders cannot deal with it because they're not allowed to speak to it. And so you've created a situation in a community that could have been resolved if that kind of thing hadn't been there. So that's just a good example of how our imposition of our rules and regulations actually impact the integrity and health and well-being of a community, a smaller community or an Indigenous community. So I talked a little bit about TwoWhite Seeing, and so this becomes an important part for the Indigenous community to understand that they can and do get Western knowledge educations. I mean, I have a PhD from the University of Toronto, but also participate in ceremony and in Indigenous teachings and well-being from my community. I live in a community pretty much half the year as well. So it's TwoWhite Seeing. So I take the strengths out of the Western knowledge base that I have and the strengths out of the Indigenous knowledge base that I have, and I put those together quite often, and they help me a lot when I'm making decisions or actually going through different things in my life. And it works for other people as well. It's not just something that we haven't got the handle on. It's not just belongs to Indigenous people, but it is a concept that comes out of the Indigenous communities. The Mi'kmaq people speak of this quite often. So it means that we want to be as collaborative as possible around knowledge bases and knowledge exchanges. It doesn't mean that you don't have the right to know about Indigenous peoples and ceremony if you're invited into it. You are, of course, and vice versa. We go to educational systems and we go to other places because it's important for us to be a part of that as well. And it's increasingly in the 2000s. So it's just a conceptual model to apply to the work that we do. I didn't see anything on that. So I want to talk a little bit about decolonization, and please start, putting questions down if you want to ask, questions as we finish. I'm going to try to finish and give you enough time to ask me questions. So the whole question about decolonization, it's an interesting concept, as I said earlier. It's not one that I necessarily utilize a lot, but I understand it. And from my perspective, it's all of us. It's not about Indigenous peoples decolonizing the federal government. It's about the federal government decolonizing itself in conjunction with indigenization. Like 75 Indigenous people ran in the federal election in 2021. That is an unheard of number of people right across the entire country running in a federal election. I think 13 Indigenous peoples were elected to Parliament out of the 75. And the reason they run is because they understand that there is a need to work from the inside out sometimes. And you guys are all in politics because you understand the same thing. It's one thing to stand on the street and say things need to change. It's another thing to be a mayor, deputy mayor, or a councillor in a city and say, you know, we have the power to listen to people in our city and to make the changes that they want. So Indigenous peoples are running in doing that decolonizing work like that for those reasons, because they know that they can see what's happening. It asks us to think about why we think the way we do. So, you know, the metacognition piece, like why do we think the way we, who taught us that Indigenous peoples were somehow substandard, or that Indigenous peoples didn't fight to protect the lands that we live on, that they gave it up easily? Who taught us that it's in, you know, that it's not, that Indigenous peoples live on reserves, or that they drink too much, or that they can't take care of their children? Who taught us those things? And that's really what the decolonization process is about, is actually learning about what those things are, and understanding that there's other kinds of answers that need to come forward to address those questions of inequity. So, and in terms of how we get there, well, you know, it has a lot to do with our own behaviors and how we as leaders, because all of you that are on this call are leaders, how we conduct ourselves in the face of understanding and working to create equitable distributions of jobs and housing and everything else for people of color. If you've been watching the news lately, you know how challenging it has been to move this particular thing. We've been talking about civil rights for a very long time, and yet Black people are still being shot down in the streets. And Indigenous women are disappearing and being killed on a regular basis. And Indigenous children are being taken from their homes as we speak by the hundreds and thousands. So it's not that we've got there. It's just that we have, you know, our ability to speak to those things has got to shift and change. And we have to see people from a more equitable lens. And letting go the need to be right, which means that our society has to understand that there, you know, not being right doesn't mean that you're wrong. It just means that it frees everybody to be human and to be a part of this conversation. And I think that that's a really important part, even just for a marriage. Give up the need to be right. You know, admitting that there have been legitimate grievances that haven't been resolved. So as a Canadian citizen speaking to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and understanding that it has received royal assent by the federal government of Canada, and it does need to be implemented. And one of the key pieces of the United Nations Declaration is restorative justice. So that means not, you know, putting people in jail just because, but it means that there needs to be a different kind of a process. And that would apply to virtually everyone in the country that has to go through the justice system. It also means through the United Nations Declaration that we all have a responsibility to deal with what's happening through the global warming process. So it's like that. No more bystanding, no more microaggressions, and you know, understanding that reciprocity of that aggression is a problem when you're talking about vulnerable people. And then calling out our own racism and biases. You know, I had somebody tell me, oh, well, you know, there's no such thing as reverse racism. I said, I'm sorry, I really think there is. I grew up with, you know, in a family who had come through residential schools. Both my parents spent 20 years between them in residential schools. And maybe it was just anger, but they really didn't like white people. So they expressed it that way. So it sounds pretty much like reverse racism to me. But because I grew up in a city like Toronto and was exposed to a lot of different peoples and to the caravan process where all of the cultures in the city got to celebrate their cultures, and we got to share in that, it never really had much effect on me. But the realities are there is a lot of biases. We all have them, and we stratify because we're human, and we need to address that, and we need to be aware of it. We all have, I like the word advantages over privileges, because I think that, you know, when you have an education, a good education, you have an advantage over people who don't. If you make $100,000 a year, you have an advantage over people who don't. And it's, you know, you could call it a privilege. Yes, I'm not, you know, denying that it is a privilege to have a very good education. but it doesn't make you better. It just gives you something that other people don't have. And we need to be respectful of that. Not everybody is cut out to be an academic or to be a police officer or to be a judge or to be a mayor. No, they're not, they're just not. It's an advantage that you have in it, and it should be treated with gently, with great respect, and them too. So let's look at the other side of that. What is indigenization? Well, for us, it's about sharing Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing in places like educational institutions, and for people that have no real access to Indigenous peoples. If you don't actually go to reserves and you don't actually attend to Indigenous facilities or like organizations, then you don't really have access to Indigenous knowledge. And I think it's so important for that to happen because it changes everything. If I'm, I don't want you to be my ally. I want you to be my friend. And that means I want to spend time with you and break bread with you, and and spend time in your company as somebody that is the same as me. Not I don't want you to sort of say, well, we'll help you over there, we'll send some money over there. I want to be able to know that we can sit down together in a room and actually have a conversation, and it is an effective way of sharing. So that's an important part. That's really what indigenization. So we have indigenized colleges and universities by virtue of our being there. I've said to university presidents, it hasn't been by the goodness of your heart that we're here. Maybe it has been initially, but it is because we demand to be here, and we demand to have the spaces associated to our needs established. And so we have indigenized. Lakehead is very indigenized. Lakehead has a president who absolutely understands the need to open the gates to Indigenous students. We have 75,000 Indigenous peoples living north and west and east of Thunder Bay, who we would like to have come to our university. So we need to create the facilities and the welcoming that is necessary to get them there. And I think every university and college across Canada is now doing the same. And I will tell you that having an education makes an incredible difference, not only for non-Indigenous people, but for Indigenous peoples as well. And the other thing that is true is many Indigenous peoples go back to their own communities when they become educated and help those communities. And when we get educated, it opens the gates. When I was probably the first person in my community to get a master's degree and then get a PhD. And now we have at least 3 other people in my community that also have PhDs. But it was unheard of at one point to do that. So opening the gates is a really important part of that. So this idea of indigenizing your board or indigenizing your council is a great way, that invitational process of bringing somebody from an Indigenous community, Black community, Asian community, whatever, into your board or your council opens the gates for other people to say, yeah, I think I'd be interested in doing that as well. And I think I can, if Cynthia can do it, I can do it. So that's, I think it's an important part. So it creates those things. So we've done, I think, a really good job of that. And now we're working on other areas to try to change those things as well. So whether it's the child welfare systems, definitely we now have Indigenous child welfare agencies. The justice system, where John Burroughs and people like that are actually creating restorative justice practices and teachings in universities, so people understand that we could get rid of this punitive system and we can do a better job across the entire country by creating restorative practice. So there's lots of things afoot that are going to be very interesting, I think, for Canada to embrace.
Cynthia, just before you continue on, there's a great question in the chat. I'm not sure if you can see it.
No, I can't.
One of the councillors have asked, we've banned Indigenous symbols from our parks and municipal facilities as a result of a complaint from a local citizen. How do we identify other areas of interest and develop joint initiatives?
Yeah, that would be what I would just say. Well, if you did a collaborative conversation on what kinds of symbols make sense, and in fact, if you just went all out, you probably have a lot of different cultures in your city. It wouldn't be just Indigenous and just white. It would be Asian and South Asian, North Asian. Like you would have a lot of people. I would have a conversation about that. I don't know why you would want to ban anything. I think the celebration of culture, period, is an important part. I've said to Thunder Bay when I was living in Thunder Bay, you need to do a caravan like they did in the city, because it changed so many lives. Many people that I grew up with that are in my age category, because I'm 65, it was a while ago that they had caravan. The people that actually went through that experience, didn't have the same kinds of issues with other cultures as people that didn't, because every culture put up a pavilion. We got to share their food, their drink, their dance, their song, everything about them, and beer if you were old enough. And it changed everything for a lot of people. So embracing all of the cultures makes more sense than just saying, well, let's put up these symbols for the Indigenous community or this other community. And you see what's happening with the, John A. Macdonald statues and, all of the statues across the cities. And those were era pieces, right? They in the time that they were established and put up, it had meaning to the people that did it. We're not trying to preclude that and say that, they don't have meaning today. If you're going to leave them up, I don't personally have any problem with leaving them up, but at least explain the history of that particular statue and the era that it was erected in, so people understand why, why it was important. And when it's got Indians looking up in supplication to, a statue of a man on a horse, a white male on a horse, explain the circumstances of the time or change that component of it or something, because it is today not okay, because Indigenous peoples have a voice today, and they say, that is not how we saw it. We want to add our voices to the conversation.
So building on that, Cynthia, there's another comment here. We made the decision to ban Indigenous images and names as a result of the directive from the Ontario Human Rights Commissioner. Should we have adopted the symbols and names with support from local Indigenous community?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think you should have challenged it.
And so we would be able to object to the OHRC directive with the Indigenous support?
Yeah, absolutely. And why I'm surprised that they would even do that. Well, how is that human rights? Yeah. I sometimes think they overstep a little bit. This is the Ontario Human Rights Commission, right? Did you say? It was the Ontario? Yeah. I don't, for me, I would see that as problematic. Why would they actually ban things like that? I mean, I know that when the government changed with Doug Ford, he immediately canceled reconciliation. He said, no, we're not doing that. And he canceled the part of the ministry that was responsible for that. And he canceled the curriculum development on Indigenous history that was in progress. So, his message was, we don't want anything to do with this. So it may have been partly that started. When was this done, this decision? Do you know?
Yeah, Cynthia, let me jump in there. Certainly this community of Clearview received very clear instruction from the Ontario Human Rights Commissioner. A letter arrived, in the afternoon in August, directed to me, the mayor, and copied to the CAO. And as a result of the directive, we immediately acted upon the directive, because it's a directive from a commissioner. And we removed Indigenous themed logos that were appearing in one of our parks. So that was well, within our ability to acknowledge the directive from the commissioner. We were then further directed in the third or fourth paragraph of the letter to create a policy that removes Indigenous themes and logos from any recreational facility or municipal facility in the township.
Wow.
And so I would be more than happy to share this letter with you. It is a public record, and I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about it.
Yeah.
Well, the point though, Cynthia, is that we, as a municipal government and as a municipality, are subject to the provincial regulations, and we must follow directions from the OHRC.
Yeah. Was there any pushback from any Indigenous communities?
It's a good thing you're here to have this discussion with us today in this workshop, because it's identifiable Indigenous community members in our community are not as vocal or engaged in our municipal processes, and that's a difficulty for us to be able to guess what their opinion may or may not be. And so it's a real difficulty for us in Clearview. So I'd be happy to meet with you and have a great discussion with you on this very point. But it is a good question that was brought up by one of our members, and it's true that
That's
Well,
just,
you're suggesting that indigenization of our municipality would actually bring those imageries or that cultural customs into our municipality, which kind of goes opposite to the directive we were given.
they would not only bring them in, they would bring in, iconography, could be paintings, they could be
Sure.
symbols in the park. I mean, Lakehead has, them all over the place. I mean, and Ottawa does. If you ever go into the House of Commons, I remember saying to them, boy, you got a lot of Indian pictures around here, but no Indians.
Yeah.
So what's
Fair
that
enough.
about? Yeah. But I think you need to have a conversation with your local, I don't know if you have a friendship center. I'm not familiar. I'll take a look at what's there. But I think that that probably, who put them up in the first place?
It's unfortunately it's the sports team game, the issue of the sports team using indigenous logos or names.
Oh, so wasn't this? Oh, okay.
So it wasn't the municipality for sure. It was a external organization that most certainly uses municipal assets to play their sports.
Oh.
But it was not the municipality that was involved in it and never has been.
That's so interesting. What's the team? What's the sports team called?
This team at that time was called the Creemore Braves.
Okay,
And,
that's interesting.
just for the record, of course, the Braves won the World Series, right?
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. Well, anyway, okay, so let's have another conversation about that, because I'm interested in so again, part of the indigenizing process is actually just having a relationship or a collaboration with Indigenous peoples in your territory.
Correct.
It doesn't mean you actually have to put up anything any more than they would, want it, the other way, right? But it just means, like, we've asked for specific space, and like if you go into a university today, that there's, generally speaking, a First Nations house or something, that because the goal is to educate Indigenous peoples in two ways, in Western ways and in their own ways, so that they can build better lives, and they can eradicate poverty and all those pieces that are still plaguing them in many instances, not all. So I think that it's a really good conversation, but it really is just creating support and space inside your institutions, inside your councils, and places where Indigenous people can feel comfortable coming in. And so if you have a big population of Indigenous peoples close by, then it's obviously a little bit different than if you have, there's not any reserve close by you, or you don't see a lot of Indigenous people, right? But still, having this knowledge base, I think, is still an important part of that.
For sure. I mean, if I could just on this topic, I know we got more to talk about, but I would not want to see us simply just go out and buy some Indigenous art and hang it in our chambers just to say we did.
No,
that's not the purpose here. That's not at all what I'm hoping. No. For sure. No, it needs to be respectful and meaningful as to why said piece of artwork in the future may be part of the public art that's owned by the municipality. Is that fair?
Same as your land acknowledgement, right?
For sure.
Yeah. I mean, if you're doing, I remember saying to a group of MPs that I was talking to about, actually, I think call to action, gosh, it would be probably 93, I think, or two. One of the last ones that was on the oath, the citizens' oath.
Right, the oath, right.
And it took them, we're now 6 years into actually having this thing ratified. And I said, and they all did a land acknowledgement when they started to speak. And I said, it's interesting to me. I had like a whole screen full of MPs. I said, y'all did a land acknowledgement because it doesn't cost you anything. You say it and then you start talking. But when it comes to passing the citizens' oath, which has restored Indigenous history to it, you're all, pushing back against it, and you don't want to actually say yes to it because it's going to cost you something. Even if it's not going to cost you money, people are going to question you. So I don't think I can respect your willingness to do the land acknowledgement on that basis. Pass the damn citizens' oath, then we'll talk. So I mean, there's and it's just like that. And the same with the Senate. I mean, there's lots of things about what they're trying to do, but again, if you're resistant because you're afraid you're going to be challenged on it, then it's not going to happen, is it? Right. So there's lots of things about this that are really important. And it does mean, even if you do nothing to change the way you do your business, if you at least know that there are treaties in Canada that are still viable, and you know that there was a residential school situation, you know why people are struggling. When you see a Joyce Echaquan on television dying because nurses are calling her good for nothing but sex and all this, then you understand that those are biases and stereotypes that have created that circumstance. Joyce Echaquan was not even, she didn't even drink. She had children at home,
Yeah.
right? Right. So you understand. So that's you, and you don't go, oh yeah, those damn Indians are always getting drunk. Like, you know, you have a different kind of a response or to what you're seeing. So that's, you know, I think an important part of that. The same with this question of cultural humility. You're engaged with cultural people all the time. You must have Muslim people in your community, Black people, like there's people in your community that have cultural affiliations or religious affiliations that may be different from yours. And that's fine. You know, the point though is that you not only understand that and appreciate it, but can you also understand and appreciate your own? You know, because it's, you know, if you don't see that there's all these things that have happened across the world and you only see through your own lens and your own personal experience, then you're not going to have the capacity to really feel compassion, I suppose. So right now we've got 40,000 Afghanistans that are coming to Canada. They're arriving. And you know, and they're not going to be, they're trying not to segregate them into urban centers. They really want them to go out into small towns and other places to restart their lives. If you can't understand that they're going to be, you know, their needs are going to be different from yours, their food needs and everything else, then it's going to be a challenge. It becomes more of a challenge than it needs to be. So the idea with cultural humility is that you understand that there's this cultural thing that you need to be aware of, that there are historic realities and contemporary realities that are going to affect those relationships. And they can be challenged. I have said to the ministers over the course of time, federal ministers, if you bring people in from Afghanistan, Sarajevo, Syria, you have to deal with their children. You have to get those children the care they need, because if you don't deal with their mental health issues, you're going to see them when they grow up. And we have now started to see that, have we not? Where you know, people are driving cars into crowds and there's all kinds of things going on, because there's a mental illness there that nobody bothered to deal with because they came in from another country and we just thought, oh, well, they'll be fine. They'll be Canadian and everything's okay. Send them to school. But they're still carrying. And I'll give you an example. I had a young, I was working with a group of recent immigrant children through the United Way. And I asked them to do just a general genealogy of their lives. And when we got to one kid, he was Somalian, and he said, I'm not doing that. And we said, oh, that's fine. You don't have to do it. We'll let everybody else will do it. And there were kids from Africa and places, you know, China, all around. And when we got to him, everybody held up their work and they explained it, where they'd come from, who their families were, you know, all these different pieces. It was very interesting, I might add. When we got to the Somalian kid, he blurted out, I'm not my father. So we all kind of stopped and went, yeah, okay. And so, you know, I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, my father killed people because his father was in the Somalian wars. And he said, I'm not going to kill anybody. And, you know, we said, well, you know, we don't think you will. And we had a conversation about it with everybody. Here's this kid, he was like 17 years old. And in his head, he's carrying this terrible fear that he might be like his father and he might kill somebody. You know, and he's getting on the bus to go to school every day. He's living in, you know, in wherever he's Toronto, wherever he was. And we had to pull that out of him and have a conversation about it and assure him that that was not the case. And the next time I saw him at a Kuchichin conversation, he was so much lighter and happier, but he was carrying that. So we need to understand that that's the case. And that cultural humility gives us the opportunity to really have a sense of that. So just a couple more. Oh, so here's what I'm talking about. So, you know, 80 million people displaced worldwide at the end of 2019. There's more now. And they're all going to be traveling. And they will be coming to us because we are a land base with a 40 million, if we're lucky, million people on it. Huge land base, bigger than the United States. and people are coming because they have no other places to go. So we are going to be in a situation with what's happening across our own country as to whether or not we say yes or we say no. And again, we're going to have to think about that. And if 40 million people in a country this size with a healthcare system that we enjoy, we need more people working and contributing. So it's going to be a very interesting conversation as we move forward, I think. But we're going to have to really think about this in that context. We have to think about those macroaggressions. We have to think about, that people that are coming into the country, Black people, LGBTQ people, marginalized people. We're now having a trans respect day because of the trans people that have been killed over the course of time. 25,000 trans people across the globe murdered because they're trans. Lots of things that we're now talking about, which we never talked about even 15 years ago. We are now talking about it. So very important part of the conversation. Racism, classism, lack of compassion. So these are the tools that we really need to think about it as we move forward. So finally, the whole question of EDI, I mean, this is a big conversation right now. Everybody's talking about it. And what does it mean? Those opportunities, the differences in individuals and being positive about it, recognizing that even though everybody's different, we have to bring them into this circle and enjoy them. I had, when I was teaching at U of T, I had a bunch of kids from one of the African countries. I forget which one it was now. Very lonely, very out of place in Toronto, came to me and said, we don't know what to do. We're unhappy. I sent them to the Friendship Center in Toronto, the Native Canadian Center. I said, go to the center on Thursday nights. They do drumming there. And all of these African kids went there and took their drums, and they had such a good time that they were back there every week because they found a place to be included. The fact that they were Black didn't matter. It's a friendship center after all, but it just brought out there all of the pieces that they needed to feel important and a part of the city. And of course, that brings us to the question of reconciliation. And how do we get to reconciliation if we cannot recognize those differences and accept those histories and cultural practices? And we eat Chinese food, Italian food, we do all those kinds of things when they suit our needs, but we have to go more. We have to do more to get to this place. I just wanted to share this racism scale with you just to have a look at. I think it's important. It was actually designed for the Black Lives Matter, and it's easy to find. You just type racism scale into Google and it'll come up. But it sort of gives you this. It could be used for any. I mean, the Asian community has been struggling through the pandemic because of the blame that was placed on them about the COVID-19 piece. So they have been struggling as well. The Black community, of course, we've seen so much damage done there. The Muslim community in Toronto, London, the family that was run down by a guy who just felt like he didn't like Muslims. The Native community, of course, we've talked about and how they feel, but it could be anything. And there's different kinds of things here that are important in terms of awareness and allyship. I think the allyship piece is important. I'd like to see it change to friendship, but it's, there's there, or the indifference. It's got nothing to do with me. I don't care. I'm not Black, whatever, justification, just have a look at it. It's an interesting piece that sort of gives you a bit of a run on how, these come from people, obviously from research and people looking at these behaviors. It's insightful. And then just are you a friend or an ally? Are you listening and really hearing the experiences that people have and the perspectives on the issues that, I've placed before you, other people have placed before you, the doing and taking collective action, not just saying it, but actually, what are you doing about it? What can your council do about these issues, these changes, recognizing different populations in your city, inviting them into the conversation, maybe having talking circles or other kinds of events, supporting arts, whatever it might be. It's not an identity. It's something that people you gain, being you're a friend or an ally because you've done things people recognize and respect you for, and educating yourself about what it is you need to do and how you can help and make things better, really, and do things a little bit different. Engaging in activism if you can. there's lots of things. I'm going to talk to women and women's groups and all kinds of people all the time about what they can do. I mean, I remember in Thunder Bay, a group of people said, well, we don't really have time to go out and, you know, join marches and things like that. So they created a small club of people that they knew across the city, and they met quarterly, and everybody brought $100 along or whatever they could. I think it was $100, and they put the $100 in a pot. And everybody also brought along one of the places in the city that they felt needed their help, whether it was a shelter or, you know, a single mom's club or, you know, whatever it was. And they put that in, and then they put the money in, and they'd have a potluck dinner, and then they pull out one, and whoever was on that list, on that piece of paper, they got all that money that month. And then they did it again and a couple months later. And so eventually covered off a lot of the places in the city that needed to have donations or resources given to them. I am on the board for the Sharing Place, which is a food bank in Aurelia, and, you know, providing, you know, we just do what we can to provide the supports that are necessary. And listening to what, you know, you don't have to apologize for anything. You don't have to feel like bad or, you know, blamed or bad about anything. You just need to have a sense of what's going on. I try to have a sense of all kinds of other cultures as well, and do what I can to speak to those kinds of concerns that they might have. And then just, you know, we'll talk, and we got some time to talk, you know, actions that you're taking in your organization to create safer spaces for Indigenous peoples or people of color. You know, and let's just have a little bit of chat about that so that we can just say, so what are the kinds of things that you are doing? What are the kinds of things that you can do? You know, how can you learn more? I put some references on here. These are really excellent books that kind of deal with pretty much everything I've talked about, the Indian Act and what things you might not know about how it was actually in place. The trauma, the whole question of trauma in children and adverse childhood experiences and how they affect people growing up. Some of the policies that have been made through the government, the story of the relocation of the CAC Dene, they would have been compensated, by the way. It's the 60 scoop, the child welfare, emotional intelligence, you know, all those pieces. So really the justice system. So there's a little bit of everything there for you. And I've given Kayla an actual book list with those books on it so that you have an opportunity to really look at it. So I'll leave it there. We have some time. I want to answer some questions. I hope that was helpful. If you want to go back and take a look at those things, Kayla will have this PowerPoint. You can actually ask her for it, and she'll share it with you. So that's in a nutshell.
Well, that's quite a nutshell, Cynthia. Thank you very much. That's a lot of information for sure. Kayla, are you still chairing this meeting, or do you want me to ask council if they have questions?
If council has any questions, this is a great opportunity to just jump in and just ask them away.
Sure. Does anybody want to jump in and ask a question? Jump right in.
Thank you. Our youth center, are we doing anything for the Indigenous community through our youth center at all? And also for Cynthia, are there other communities who have programs in their youth centers that support the Indigenous community?
Yes. Yes, most centers make an effort, especially, like I said, if you have a community, Indigenous community that's fairly close to you, that actually come and use your services, whether it's education or the hospitals or, you know, whatever it might be. It's good to have something, and most youth centers understand that people, you know, kids of color need a little bit more support than other kids. They have a less advantage, I suppose, but not always, but sometimes. But yeah, they better know that your city. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. I don't even know what percentage of our community, of our township, is Indigenous. But I'd be interested to know. And maybe I'm not sure if Terry's on here or not, or maybe Kayla. But that might be something that we could do in the youth center, is to ensure that we have some sort of programs to support the Indigenous youth, and maybe even to get them into the youth center more often. So anyway, just a thought.
Good question, Doug. If I can, Barry and Robert, you guys are members of that committee. Is there any discussion of that point? Have you had any of that? I'm sorry, I haven't had any contact with the committee for a while. Any comments, Walker or Burton?
Yeah, I was going to say, Robert probably knows better than I do. I've missed a couple of meetings there. So I'm not aware. I just don't know if we do or if we don't. I know we have different nationalities there. I know we have a wonderful team there that do a great job working with the youth. So, but
For sure.
Specifically, that's geared towards Indigenous youth. I'm not sure.
Robert?
Thank you, Worship. Not really hasn't specifically come up. No, it has not.
Okay.
The LGBTQ community has and that's about the only one that has come forward that we are working with. So there certainly is an opportunity. And numbers, I can't answer that. I don't know Indigenous numbers that come to our youth center. I'm not sure. I just don't know that.
Well, they may not.
Good question.
Yeah, they don't always want to be identified if it's not, if it's not a lot. Sometimes it's the parents who say, my son or my daughter needs a little bit more support here. Is there a way to get that? I mean, like when I was living in Thunder, I mean, even here, because we live very close to Rama First Nation. It's 20 minutes away. And my community is Georgiana Island, which is, about 45 minutes away. And Christian Island is an hour away. Like, we're pretty surrounded by our communities as well. So, we make a point of having a friendship center, and, there's a friendship center in Barrie. And all kids can use those friendship centers. It's not only for Indigenous kids, it's for everybody. So it's an interesting, it's not always essential. It's just good as Canadians, I think, to know something about the history, because they didn't always teach it in high school. And, if you get to university, you get a better chance of learning something about the history. But even then, it's not that much, because I went to university, I didn't get that much.
Okay. Cynthia, if I can, I'm going to go to Jennifer LaChapelle. She's our head librarian. She's the CEO of our library. Jennifer, you put a comment in there. Jen, do you want to jump in and say hello and tell us what's going on with the library? With you've made a comment. I think the council should hear it. Go ahead.
So Clearview Public Library for almost 15 years has had a partnership with Saugeen First Nation Public Library. And this partnership was developed with the Crown Agency for Libraries. So we didn't select this particular First Nation, but we were selected because of our size differential. And we were the first small public library to have a partnership with a First Nation public library. And what we do with them is they tell us the kinds of materials that they're struggling, library materials, obviously, to provide to their residents. And we go through what we are removing from our current collection that they might have some use for, and also through donations. We get a lot of materials that we already have in our collection donated to us. Normally we would sell them to make money to buy more materials, but we go the extra step. And if it's something they've requested, we make sure they get that. So we've been doing that for almost 15 years.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah. Books are really important. I did my doctoral work in a remote community, and I remember it was one of the things I wanted to do, because they had a little library, but everything was in boxes. And I was like, well, how is anybody going to read these books? They're all in boxes. But they didn't have a librarian, obviously, to really take that on. And I have sent up books. I was up in a remote community in Northern Labrador, remote. And I remember that they were reading, what's it called? No, there's a book that everybody reads in high school, not The Discoverers, but The Outsiders. The Outsiders. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I said, is that the only book that you have? And they said, well, yeah. And so I sent them a whole bunch of books from Indigenous authors, including Lee Miracle, who just died on November 11th. Her book on, it's got a name, I can't remember the name of the girl's name, but anyway, but similar kinds of books. I said, it might be useful to have your Indigenous students have some Indigenous insight from people that wrote, the similar stories. So, and don't live in cities, because these people were all living, they live in a very remote community. So right on the line. Yeah. So that's a good, and there's things like that we can do. We can get together with, we can attend things we can see different, watch the Inspire Awards, because it's so fascinating to see what the Indigenous community has contributed, or even just asking questions. I don't know how many of you eat, what's that chicken, Swiss Chalet chicken, but that sauce was developed by a guy who was a chief when I knew him, of one of the communities in southern central Ontario, Hiawatha. He was the guy that designed that sauce. He won the contest that actually created that sauce, but nobody ever knew about it, right?
That's fantastic. That's fantastic.
And then the first color tube, when we had long ago, when we had black and white TV, and then we had colored tubes. It wasn't like it is now. Was designed by a Native guy as well.
So there you go. Thank you very much. Okay, well, Councillor McKechnie, thank you for the question. I think, did I see Councillor Patterson? Tom, did you have another one there? Yeah, go ahead, Tom. And then we'll move on. Go ahead, Tom.
Oh, you're on mute.
Okay, first one of the meeting. Good job, Tom.
Sometimes it's the best way to be. So I'm going to go way up to a nation level, just because, we live in this news world and we hear so many opinions about this subject. Is the goal to reach a cultural, economic, governance, equality, and independence? Or are we moving towards a collaborative, more evolved, let's say, indigenized nationhood?
Well, I guess I would say the first before the other. I think that the Indigenous communities are establishing governance within Confederation. They're not looking to be floating off over here while Canada's over here. It's within Confederation. They'll be a part of that conversation. The sovereignty issue is there are communities across Canada that talk about sovereignty. That's probably what you're talking about. The Haudenosaunee, the Mohawk, Iroquois, and peoples are, see themselves as sovereign nations, but they're still collaborative to Canada because they still have, transfer payments, and they still have access to healthcare and all those things, right? So they're still going to be. What we're looking for is the jurisdiction and authority restoration. So you can't control our kids. We have the right to control what happens to our children. We have the right to define our education systems, with the reading, writing, arithmetic also a part of that, so that that we would amend the curriculum to accommodate our needs, so we can actually teach Indigenous languages, which we have not ever been able to do up till fairly recently. So if you can see it within Confederation, you understand what we're looking for, so that we can make our own decisions, more decisions about the laws in our communities. The human rights code applies in our communities. Many communities have the laws are provincial. But one of the things that some communities are looking for is, if we have to use provincial laws, and we live on an island, why are we, when we find somebody for speeding in our community, why are we sending the money to the Ontario coffers? Why are we not putting that into our own coffers and building up the economy in our own communities, so that we don't have to go to the Ontario government to say, can you give us some money so we can put up a stop sign? We would have the resources to accommodate that ourselves. So there's different elements of that I think are important for us to understand. And it is within Confederation, though. We're not establishing separate countries or provinces or anything like that. And by the way, the whole setup of 636 First Nation communities across Canada was a federal design. Indigenous communities were nations, and they wanted to stay that way. But Canada did not want them to be contiguous, because if they were in a nation, there was always the fear, for some reason, that they would revolt and they would cause a problem. So they separated them all into these very small little postage stamps of land, and they broke it all up, and it weakened the governance systems. And then they imposed the Indian Act in 1876, which essentially said, you will have an Indian agent who will rule here. And at the time, anybody could be chief of a community, including a non-native person, because they could put the Indian agent in place to make decisions. And everybody had to go to the Indian agent to sell hay, or to buy a horse, or to hoe a property. So you have to understand there's this really detailed history. Even when farmers were automating and had tractors, they told Indians, that they called them at the time, that they could only use plows because they had to evolve. You know, and so how are they supposed to compete with farmers using tractors if they're using horse and plow? You know, so there was a lot of things that happened through the course of time that created this inequitable thing you see today, and we're still trying to catch up. Those gaps are quite hard to overcome. And you know, you couldn't develop your land without permission from the Indian agent, and then of course the government of Canada. The education systems were put in place by the government, you know, by the governments. They're federally run now. More of them are run by the First Nation communities themselves, but we didn't have our own laws around education, and now we do. So it depends a lot on the community. My community is still under the Indian Act, but other communities have stepped outside the Indian Act and have implemented their own systems, but they're still within Confederation.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so
I
thank
think
you.
that's amazing. Thank you very much, Cynthia, for joining us, and I really appreciate hearing from you. I am going to reach out to you, and I'll get contacts with you through Kayla, and share some of that documents with you. And we really appreciate you chipping in today.
No problem, no problem. I'll head off to another meeting now. Okay. So you guys have great. Thanks, Kayla. We'll talk again.
All right.
Yes, thank you so much,
Okay.
Cynthia, for your time, information, and expertise. You're absolutely right. It's a very extensive topic, and I believe that you've added to that spark for additional knowledge and understanding of the Indigenous history and perspective. Thanks for helping to provide that additional context information as we move forward towards truth, reconciliation, and creating the meaningful relationships that will assist in creating a more inclusive and collaborative community in Clearview Township.
Yeah, good enough. All right, you guys take care. Stay safe.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.
I see
All right,
Jennifer
Kayla?
Sutterfield has joined us, and we'll continue the conversation on Indigenous law and restorative justice. Jennifer?
Hi, Jen.
Hello, everybody. How's everybody doing?
Great. Did you tune in for some of this discussion already?
Oh, I did. And she did such a great job. I loved it.
That's great. Well, welcome. Nice to meet you.
Thank you. I see a lot of screens are black, and I'm sure that the previous presenters said how hard it is to present to everybody when they can't see your faces. So I was just wondering if maybe I could get some beautiful faces on. So I'm not
I
seeing
agree with you,
black
Jen, 100%.
screens.
You know, these are the staff members who work with us here at Township of Clearview. And, you know, it's kind of traditional, I guess, in our council meetings. The councilors sort of leave their cameras on, and then the staff people sort of jump in whenever they're called upon. But I like seeing their faces too. So thanks for bringing it up, Jen.
So first I want to say bonjour, Ani, Jen Nadishkanaz. That means hello, welcome. My name is Jennifer. I am a grade 7 teacher at Huron Park. My first contract this year, and I've been placed in a classroom that has 50% First Nation students in it. I have First Nation and Métis. The students are required to self-identify, and if they do not self-identify, then I don't know if they are, other than them telling me. So the way that I start my school year is by having a circle. And for the first 3 weeks, we go outside, we have our circle and we talk. And the main goal for the circle is to listen with your eyes. That is why I asked you to put on your cameras, because I want to see all of your beautiful eyes. That is a major need for every First Nation person, is to see the honesty in your eyes. And that's why when I am speaking to you, I will be looking or trying to look at all of you, because it's really important for me to know that you're engaging with me. Once I do my presentation, you can totally shut off your screen. You don't need to have it on there because I'm not going to see anyways. Anybody have any questions, first of all, for me before I start, about anything to do with First Nation, Métis, Inuit that you didn't already have answered by the previous presenter? The only reason why I'm asking that is because I'm in a school system, and I'm sure you understand that the school system is designed for mainstream education. So it's not specifically designed for our First Nation, Métis, Inuit students. And I think for you to better understand the way that the system works and the restorative justice, which is what I'm going to present, is worked within our system, is actually occurring a lot more than you believe. I just did a restorative justice circle this morning with a group of students. So is there anybody that has any pre-questions before we start? And if not, I will totally do my presentation. All right, that's okay. So, oh, yes, go ahead.
Well, I might as well jump in here. I'm sure you're going to address this anyway, but when I looked at your presentation, I don't see a whole lot there about any sort of punishment. So will you be addressing that in your presentation?
Oh, yes. You will be shocked.
Okay. All right. Well, shock me. Shock me.
All right.
Okay.
So let's start first of all. Who can tell me what kind of justice system we have in Canada? Who wants to speak up and explain what it is that we do for our justice system, for our youth and for our adults? Anybody?
I'm just going to add, this is for anybody on the screen.
Oh, come on. You guys know exactly what's going on with the
You're
justice
innocent
system in
until
Canada.
proven guilty? Is that the?
Yes. So can somebody tell me maybe how the process goes? What is the first thing that happens when a youth or an adult is accused of a crime?
They would be investigated and then charged.
Okay, so then where are they held?
Depends on what the charge is. They could be held in a local jail, or they could be transferred to another facility.
Absolutely. Now, after
Can I ask, Jen, would they also just, or they could just be simply held in custody, as in the presence of an officer or someone in authority, correct?
Absolutely. The point is that they are removed from their families.
Correct.
And they are taken to an area where there's unfamiliarity. There is, I would probably say, solidarity. There is anger that's going to occur with your person. So the question is, what happens once that individual is then prosecuted? What happens to that youth or that adult once they are prosecuted by a judge and a member of their peers?
Well, it depends on what the verdict is.
Just in general.
They're in front of a system that they don't understand.
Okay, so then where are they held? Like, what happens to them? They are now proven guilty, and where do they go from there?
They go to jail.
They go to jail. And that jail is funded by who?
The
Provincial and
government.
federal governments,
And who also pays for portions of that funding?
municipalities, taxpayers.
And who, thank you very much. It's the taxpayers. So you can actually go and commit a crime, and everybody else pays for you to get 3 meals a day, to have a roof over your head. You get to go outside. You get to essentially live a very hassle-free life, I guess you could say, if you aren't part of a gang, if you're in a minimum security. But generally, once you offend, and it's pretty serious, once you're out, you can't go get a job. You are not going to be as successful as you were before committing the crime. So you're technically going to reoffend. The chances of reoffending are pretty high. That is where restorative justice comes in, and that is what I'm going to teach you today. Okay, so let's hope I don't mess this up. Okay, Kayla, help me figure out how to present.
I can share your presentation, Jen.
Can you?
If you would like, yeah.
Okay.
And you could just tell me to switch slides. So just a moment.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, you can shut your cameras off now. You don't need to see. Okay, so can we go to the next slide, please? Perfect. So restorative justice views crime as more than breaking the law. It has harmed people, relationships, and the community. So a just response must address those harms as well as the wrongdoing. If the parties are willing, the best way to do this is to help them meet to discuss those harms and how to bring about resolution. That is just essentially an anonymous person. Can you go to the next slide, please? So the theory of restorative justice is that we are repairing a relationship between the person. So anybody that commits a crime within a First Nation community, some Métis communities and Inuit communities are going to essentially face the person that they've committed their crime against. So for example, let's say I go over to Kayla's house and I break into her house and steal some money. By the way, Kayla will never do that, don't worry. And Kayla comes home and finds her house broken into and finds the money that I stole. And she knows it's me because let's say she has cameras and she's caught me on her camera. That money that she had, maybe that went to her mortgage payment or her rent or her car payment, or it was for her children's Christmas. And therefore that causes her the inability to purchase those things or pay those bills. And then it sometimes becomes one of those domino effects. Maybe she misses a payment and the bank has to contact her. Her children don't have a Christmas. Maybe she has her car repossessed. Whatever it is, that act of violence and that dishonest behavior and disrespectful behavior, it needs to be addressed. So in First Nation culture, Inuit culture, what they do is they find the victim and they find the perpetrator and they do a restorative circle. And what that means is there could be a lawyer there could be a judge, there could be the police officers that were arresting, there could be family members if they want, and they all sit in a circle and they go around and they talk about how that person made them feel. And it's about addressing that criminal behavior and then having the perpetrator apologize for that behavior. As I said before, it's about looking in the eyes of your person. So it's really hard to admit when you're wrong. And admitting when you're wrong is all about being able to be honest. And that is one of the 7 grandfather teachings of the Anishinaabe. And you need to be truthful and you need to be honest and you need to be respectful. So if I'm going to be truthful, honest, and respectful to Kayla for doing that criminal behavior, I have to look her in the eyes and I have to apologize for that behavior. Apologies don't have to be accepted. She doesn't have to accept my apology on the grounds that I really wrecked her life or I really caused her to have trauma. And that's okay because she's allowed to express that to me. With that being said, it's now my duty as the person that hurt her to make it right. Maybe something that I could do is work another job. I could save up the amount of money that I stole from her and I can repair the window and give it back to her. There's no set time. There's no, there's no rush for it. I will know when I have made it right with Kayla. I go to her house, I fix her window, I give her money back, I leave. We might have another circle. She might say, you know what? You have made me whole. Thank you very much. And that I move on. I don't go to jail. I don't get charged by the police. I don't get to sit in the back of a car. I don't get to go to a jail. I don't have to do probation. And that's how we keep our youth and our adults out of the justice system, is by using the restorative justice practice. Now, this isn't something that is new. This has always been around. And when your past presenter was speaking about the laws and the way that First Nations wanted to govern themselves, this is exactly what they used in order for them to get through that. That's why you never see a prison on a reserve, because that's not how they work. Probation is like volunteer. You're essentially, they have I guess a portion of it in the actual Canadian justice system where probation is volunteer work, but you're told what to do. The job of the perpetrator is to find out what is needed by that person in order to make it right. And I think that's the most important part that you can recognize is it's your job to make them feel whole. And it's your job to make sure that you are doing whatever you can. And if it's not working, you're going to have to try a different strategy. And you will try and try until you make it right. So I'm just going to read the rest of the slide. Restorative justice is a theory of justice that emphasizes repairing the harm caused by criminal behavior. So I've already discussed that. It is best accomplished through cooperative processes. So we both need the perpetrator and the victim to make this restorative justice a success. Okay. This can lead to transformation of people, relationships, and communities. A lot of the time when we have restorative justice circles and there's a situation with a victim and the person that I call them perpetrator, but there's other ways to address them. Sometimes what happens is they end up recognizing that that perpetrator might not have a family. Maybe that person is going through some mental health. Maybe that person is struggling or has some generational trauma or just trauma in general. And a lot of times there's a reciprocating of love and respect between the two of them, that not only do they take what the person gave back to them as an apology, but lots of times they also feel like they need to help that person in some sort of way. So it doesn't just benefit the person that was harmed, but sometimes it can benefit the person that did the harming. And that's the whole point, is to make everybody feel whole. Because once a person admits that they're wrong, that is probably one of the hardest things to do, especially as an adult, especially as a strong-willed individual. It's the hardest to admit when you're wrong, but once you do it, it's not that hard anymore to be able to say, I was wrong and I'm going to make it up to you. So that's what restorative justice is. You can go to the next slide. So here's your big ideas of restorative justice. You're going to repair. So that's going to be your actual circle that you're going to have with all of the people that have been harmed. And then you're going to encounter at the end of your circle what it is that you need to make yourself feel whole again. And you have to make that decision together. It's not the person that was doing the harming's job to make that decision. They also need to express what they want to do. So if I've broken into Kayla's house and I've stolen her money, she could say to me, do you know what? Instead of giving me the money, why don't you just get my children some Christmas presents and we will call it even. And that's the plan that we've come up with. And then I have to follow through, and I will follow through because I'm respecting her wishes. And I'm also trying to show some humility by moving forward and making sure that she is feeling whole. And I'm also showing love, big time love, for her children and for her and for myself, because I want them to see that I am not a bad person and I don't want those children to be scared of being broken into again. And then we have our transformation. And once a person admits they're wrong, a lot of things change. And I think that's the difference between a restorative circle compared to the justice system, because it's so easy to say, I didn't do it, and then bank on the fact that your lawyer can get you out of it, and that the judge will believe you, and that those peers will believe you. And you're just sitting there crossing your fingers and go, I'm going to get out of this. It's going to be okay. But you never really admit that you're wrong. And then you get to live the rest of your life knowing that you did something wrong. And I don't know about you, but that would pretty much eat me up alive. And I guess there are some people in this world that that's okay, that they can live like that. But generally, in the scheme of things, not everybody likes to live with a burden or a regret. So that's what the transformation portion is that you end up transforming who you are because you were able to admit that you were wrong and then you made it right. You can go to the next slide. So we've already discussed the way our justice system is, but is there anybody that has any questions right now about what I just explained? I hope I didn't go too quickly.
Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Jennifer. So what happens then if someone goes into, if someone just refuses to accept the blame that they were wrong to do what they did? What happens then?
Are you talking about like First Nation people refusing that they're wrong? Or are you talking about European descendants refusing to say that they were wrong?
Well, let's talk about First Nation people. But
Okay.
why would there be? Why is there a difference?
There's a difference because there's a code. When you're First Nation, Métis, Inuit, it's easy to admit that you're wrong. It's the punishment that's the scary part. That's the problem. When we talk about if I'm going to switch over to European people, the punishment has always been either you get beheaded or you get stoned or you get shot by a whole bunch of people or you go to prison for life. And nobody wants those things. And people are in this mindset that admitting that you're wrong, you're somehow going to physically explode or something bad is going to happen to you. But in the scheme of things, it's all about honesty. And that is exactly what is the Anishinaabe 7 grandfather teachings is all about, which all Anishinaabe people, Cree, they have their own 7 grandfather teachings. The Iroquois, they have their own 7 grandfather teachings as well. So they're all different, but mine is Anishinaabe. And when you think about those and you talk about that in your sort of justice circle, it's almost like a pull to be honest. You live a very honest life, and the people that you see that are First Nations, Métis, Inuit, that aren't living an honest life, they've fallen and they've lost their way. And it's really hard for them to get back to where they are because they're not in line with themselves, if that makes any sense. So I guess I should probably just finish answering your question. I've worked at the Barrie Native Friendship Center, and I worked in the Wassanaben program, and I had 13 to 18-year-old students, and I had to go to court with them, and we would sit there and we would wait for their number to come up, and then we would go up, and I had nothing to do. I had no influence whatsoever with my client. All I would say is, you have a choice. You can either be honest and truthful and accept your punishment, or you can lie and you can let it eat yourself alive. And my 3 clients that went to court, they all stopped saying that they never did it. And they said, yes, I did it. I absolutely did do it. And it's freeing. It's powerful to be able to say that. Nobody exploded. Nobody died. Everything was okay. They took their punishment, and their punishment was either anger management courses at the Barrie Native Friendship Center. Their other punishment was to make it whole. They participated in restorative justice circles. And then one of the guys went on probation, and because he was homeless, he had the court system tell him what he needed to do. I think that was pretty good on their part to do that. Had they lied, okay, they would have went to jail, and they would have sat in a room with people that were just like them, and they would have never learned what it was like to be freed and powerful and courageous and honest about things. And therefore that's the whole problem. It's like being sneaky and getting away with stuff. Like, why would you want to do that? Why would you ever want to purposely hurt somebody and then not take responsibility for it?
Okay, thank you. And if I could ask one more question here. So let's use the analogy. Sorry about that. Hang on a second. Telemarketing, I'm sure. Let's use the analogy of stealing from Kayla again. So if I break into Kayla's house and steal some money from her house, and you're talking about me possibly making it whole, well, that's not really much of an incentive. If I steal $100 and if I have to repay that $100 and apologize, or maybe buy her children some gifts or worth $100, that's not much of an incentive or a punishment. I'm thinking, like, is there the restorative justice? Do they have the capability, or do you have the capability to require someone to pay double, let's say, or triple? So if you steal $100, you got to pay back $300.
It's really up to the victim. I mean, the victim could sit there and go, do you know what? You stole $100 from me. I want you to pay me back $500. And
okay,
I want you to come over and I want you to shovel my driveway for the rest of winter. Like,
all right,
that could be something that they say. And the person can say no. They can negotiate. They could say, okay, wait, hold on. How about I pay you $400 and I come and I fix your window for free and shovel your driveway every Monday and Friday. And if Kayla goes, yeah, you know what? That's a good deal. And that's their agreement. And that is a binding agreement between the two of them. He can't renege on his agreement and she can't ask for more. Okay.
and
if
they can't come to an agreement,
if they can't come to the agreement, then they go to jail, right? Then they're
Okay,
charged and they are put into the system. Now, please be advised, though, that you're allowed to have the police officer there. That's the arresting officer. There could also be, depending on how bad the crime is, there could also be another solution, right? If you don't make Kayla whole, then this will happen. That's your if-then statement, right? If you don't do this, then this happens. So the police officer could say, well, you know what? If you don't make Kayla whole, then I'm going to get you to volunteer in a youth center with students that are struggling with poverty. And you have to work there for 6 months to 8 months. And you will go there after school and we will come and check in on you. It's not probation, it's free time. And generally you make those concessions as a person that's done the wrongdoing, because that's what we grew up with. That's what we learned about. That's who we are. The only reason why it might be difficult for some is because it just doesn't make any sense. And like, I was explaining to my students the other day about what restorative justice was. And I had a student flat out lie to me about what they had done. And we just sat there quietly and I just waited. It's called wait time. And I was like, I can wait all day until you tell me the truth. That's fine. I'm not going to pressure you. I'm not going to give you an ultimatum. I'm just going to wait quietly right here, sitting, staring at you with my big brown eyes. And sure enough, 15 minutes later, I think he thought that I was going to break, but I didn't. And he finally said, okay, yeah, you're right. You're right. I did it. And I said, awesome. Thank you so much for telling me the truth. How's that feel? And he's like, well, I didn't blow up like you said. And I was like, yeah, that's true. Moving forward, do you understand the importance of just being honest? And he was like, yep. And I was like, and you wasted my lunchtime. You wasted your lunchtime. I am 50 minutes late for my break for my class. I had somebody take over my class. Everybody is now out because you chose to lie. And that's the whole point of it, is for them to see how everybody else is kind of bothered by what they did based on the fact that they just lied. If you just told the truth, everybody would be fine. I would have been like, cool, awesome, thanks. Don't do it again. Okay, let's go outside, right?
Okay, thank you.
Can we go to the next slide? So the foundational principles of restorative justice. Number one, crime causes harm and justice. So we know that already. The people most affected by the crime should be able to participate in the resolution. We now know that. And number three, the responsibility falls on the perpetrator to make amends to assure the victim feels heard and whole. We can go to the next slide. There we go. So I guess my question for you is, do you agree or disagree with this way of thinking? And give me your perspective.
It's John. I've gone through the restorative justice process with a youth that had committed property damage in Nova Scotia, and so they brought in the person that had the property damage, and social workers working with the individual came in and they worked out an arrangement that was able to keep that young fella out of jail and in school still, and still repair the damage on the property and make it work, and they were able to work it out. The justice system that we have, our traditional justice system, is still in the background, in the sense that if you have an individual that doesn't have the conscious or self, what's what I'm looking for, the a good conscience to admit that they've done something wrong and apologize, then in some cases there's people in all walks of life that are deviant enough that they just won't do that. And so that still exists to a certain extent in society. And but I would say for young people in particular that need a second chance, need another opportunity, and to see that they fit into the community. I think this really brought him closer to somebody in his community that he didn't respect before. And maybe that person didn't respect the young fella, who knows? But at the end of the day, they respected each other after that process. And so it's an opportunity for them to come together and move forward in the community, so to speak. But I can't say it works in all cases, but it certainly worked in that case.
Thank you for sharing. You're right. It doesn't work in all cases. And let's say this person reoffended again. There's options now. So we did the restorative justice the first time. You clearly didn't learn. Let's try restorative justice again. And then if it's not working, then you will enter into the prison system. So I know that when you go to the court system, they have programs. For example, I know there's Angry Man. Angry Man is a program through the Native Friendship Centers all across Ontario, where if you have a man that is domestic abusing his wife or his children, he can actually enroll in this program and complete it. And then the hopes is that he has learned from it. So restorative justice isn't going to work for a person like that who's actually physically abusing somebody. You have to be able to learn from that. Maybe there is something underlying trauma that we can't see, and that needs to come out. So those programs like Anoctic Healing Lodge, that's in Vasey, we have our friendship centers, we have our women's programs. Those kinds of places we need to outsource more for and give them more funding so that we can have them help our youth. It doesn't have to just be First Nations. It doesn't have to be Métis or Inuit. It needs to be all youth. And if we start using that framework, I think you would find that people would start learning and respecting a little bit better of the people that they're actually harming, because they're taking the time to listen, and then they're also taking the time to make things better. However, you are correct. There is that back burner of the justice system kind of sitting there, and it's almost like, well, if you're not going to follow the rules and expectations, this is where you're going to go. This is where you're headed. And we're doing all of these things to help you. And if you're not willing to help yourself, then you're going to go here. Right now, we are sitting with 50% First Nation people in jails right now. And the reason why we have so many First Nation people in jails is not because of the protests that are happening. That's actually not it at all. we're finding that a lot of them are dealing with intergenerational trauma. A lot of them are dealing with alcohol and drug abuse. They're not making the right decisions because there's not a lot of access to those kinds of programs where they're living. For example, let's just imagine an individual on a reserve that is abusing drugs or alcohol. Where are they supposed to go to get any programs? They have to leave that reserve and go into, you know, cities and towns. You're asking a person that doesn't know anything about a city or town to leave what they know and to go somewhere else. And then now they're an outsider. Police have never seen them before. They do something wrong, which normally would be okay where they are on a reserve, but it's not okay in a city or a town or a village. And now they're in jail. And that's what I'm hoping, especially with youth, to work on in my classroom, is to stop that behavior. I'm in a school where I guarantee you 25% of my students will be in jail by the time they are 18 years old. I have one student that already knows he's going to go to jail. I don't want that to happen to them because they don't deserve that. They shouldn't have a mindset like that, but they do. Unfortunately, they do. And I want to give them at least 1 year where they can feel like they're being heard, where they feel like they're being respected, and where they feel that they can be safe in these 4 walls of my classroom. And if I can do that for 1 year, and I can be the person that they need, then I hope as they move forward, they can remember, oh yeah, Miss Summerfield told me about restorative justice. She taught me about circles. She told me that I'm not going to explode if I tell the truth. And I hope that as they move forward, that they will have that opportunity to be like, yep, I did it. It was my fault. How do I make it right? Some of them are doing it right now in class, and some of them are still stubborn. And that's okay, because that's what my principal is for, which I guess would be the exact same as my principal is like my justice system, and I am the restorative section, right? So that's just kind of how I have to look at it. You can go to the next slide if you want. So this is our 4 main components of the restorative justice, just to kind of wrap it up. We have inclusion of all parties, we have encountering the other side, we have making amends, and then we have reintegration back into the communities, knowing that you did the right thing. And is this my last slide? Oh, that's it. So could this be a new strategy used at your facility? Explain how you would integrate this into your policies and your procedures. Would this be beneficial for your area? I know you guys don't live that far away from me.
Jen, I don't want to, if somebody else has something to say, please feel free to go ahead of me. I'm okay with that. I would like to say that when it comes to a municipal government, for example, a lot of our facilities, to a certain extent, we're not encouraging anybody to create vandalism. But if they are vandalizing something, the residents are typically a lot not happier, but they're glad it wasn't their property. If it was a municipal facility or something that they, threw a rock through a window or something. But ultimately, that act or that damage to the municipality is really to everybody in the municipality, because they pay for those facilities. And the restorative justice system, I think, in that, when you explain to a young offender or somebody of that nature who just went down the wrong road, maybe that particular day, but if you explain to them, what the cost is, and typically it's a lot more expensive because everything in a municipality is held at a different standard. Like if you broke a door, it's usually a very expensive door. If you break a window, it's usually a very expensive window. If you beat up the siding of a building, it's usually expensive siding. And when they come in and they realize the cost, it usually improves their behavior with restorative justice. So I think there's an opportunity there, and it's got to be managed in a certain way. And we'd have to involve people if it involves an Aboriginal youth, I think it should involve somebody from the Aboriginal community, so that they have somebody that, is there and understands the culture a little bit better than maybe some European descent, I guess would be the way I would say it, and maybe make this work out a little better, and everybody come together and improve. So I think there's an opportunity for it. I do, and we don't often know who does the vandalism, and if we find out, but I think there's a role that could be played there.
So I'm going to piggyback off what you just said. I hear that you would show them. I would be more inclined to have them actually participate in the fixing of the vandalism,
Right.
the painting. They need to join the actual company that's doing it. They need to see how much work goes into this. And I think that's the whole point, is to, all right, see what you did, come on over here. And now you're going to go through the whole process of fixing everything that you did. Obviously they can't go to every single house in the whole entire community and go, I'm very sorry for vandalizing a piece of property that you pay for. But essentially that would be one of the ways to do a restorative justice. You vandalized, now you need to paint it. You need to spend your whole day doing it. And then you can go around the whole entire town and say, you're sorry to every single person that's a taxpayer. That would be restorative justice. That's not going to be feasible, obviously, but that essentially would be what it is. And I also just want to say, we don't say Aboriginal.
Oh, okay.
We say Indigenous. And the reason why we don't say Aboriginal is because Aboriginal is the same as abnormal. So that's why we don't say that. We'll say
Oh, really?
Indigenous.
Okay.
Okay.
Right.
Just so you know.
I'm glad you pointed that out.
You're welcome. It's okay. It's okay. I just want everybody to know that we don't like Aboriginal. And if you hear it, teach them to, please. Yes.
I was just going to say, I really like the concept of restorative justice. To me, it brings the entire awareness of the whole impact of the harm, and to me, it should give the, for lack of a better word, the perpetrator the opportunity to see the harm and understand it and grow from that. I really like that concept. There's so many times I can think of in the past when I've seen the typical justice system and the way it seems to impact people, and there just isn't that opportunity for growth there. If anything, a lot of the time it teaches, or seems to teach, the very opposite.
I actually agree with you 100%, because like my students say, all I have to do is commit a crime. I don't ever have to work again. I'll get food and I'll get a roof over my head. I'll never have to worry about owning a car. I'll never have to worry about buying a house or renting. I'll always have a place to go, and I'll always have food. And if I get out of jail, all I have to do is commit another crime and I can go back in. And when my students said that, first of all, I was like, what? But they're so right. They're so incredibly right. And then they sit there forever and they don't get to think about what they've done. They just get to, some of them get to come out with an education, for goodness sakes, right? And then us people that go and get our education, we pay thousands and thousands of dollars to obtain it. And then we work our lives to get to the career that we want. And we are happy and we are hardworking and we're proud of. But that's, I guess, the difference and the different mentality that you have with regards to a person that is willing to work for that, which means you're going to have a person that's willing to participate in restorative justice, as opposed to a person that doesn't care and they're not going to participate in the restorative justice. So you're going to have your two people. But I think that everybody should be given the opportunity to try before they head to the prison system. That's wholeheartedly what I think. Absolutely.
I would agree.
Jennifer, do you mind telling me, do you have any numbers on the rates of recidivism between, the restorative justice system and traditional justice system? Which is better?
I actually don't have any of those numbers. To be completely honest, I do know that in a court system, if a person is self-identified as a First Nation, Métis, or Inuit individual, they get a different treatment off the bat. So it also depends, because I know that if you have an area that has a higher number of self-identified people, then you generally have those facilitators in the actual court system. So if you're in an area that doesn't have that, for example, like I taught at Tottenham at the beginning of the school year, not a single one of my students even knew what a First Nation, Métis, or Inuit person was. In Tottenham, they didn't even know what a residential school was. They didn't even know who Chani Wenjack were, or Gord Downey, or the Secret Path. They had no idea. And so therefore areas like that wouldn't have programs as the First Nation, for friendship centers, which they don't. I already checked. They also don't have a women's program. They don't have Angry Man. They don't have a First Nation court appointed Wasanaben worker. So we're actually doing a disservice in areas that lack that. And that's the reason why we have so many First Nation, Métis, Inuit people in jails, is because we don't have everybody covered in all of Ontario. We just have the general places covered. Midland, that's where I'm from. We have a lot of resources, so many everywhere, that walking into the court system, all I have to say is, my client is a First Nation person. And they're like, okay, well, it's in a completely different courtroom. You can go over there and sit with them. And they're treated differently right from the get-go. So if we had that opportunity, I think we'd have less people in the actual system than we do right now.
When you
I can
say
just jump
treated
in.
differently,
Jump in for a minute again. I think jump in if I can. Perhaps, Madam Clerk, you could take the shared screen off, and that way we can see each other and have a better conversation. Just to help us look at our eyes again, Jen. Is there somebody who wanted to jump in there? I didn't catch who that was.
Yeah, I have a follow-up here, Your Worship. So, Jennifer, so you said treated differently in the traditional system. Are they treated worse or treated better?
Worse.
Worse. Okay.
Yeah. Please be advised that there are still a lot of racism that's going on in our court system, and still a lot of racism going on in the streets and in our schools. When I came to Huron Park, which is the school that I'm at right now, and I wrote, tell me all the words that you know for First Nation people, I got words such as alcoholic, drunk, loser, savage, dirty, disgusting. I got all of those words. These are grade 7 children. These are 11 and 12-year-olds, and those are the words they know. Why do they know those words? Because it's brought through the generations of how we are perceived. And that's because of our residential schools. That's because of our reserves. That's because of our 60 scoop. That's because of our white paper that was written by Pierre Elliott Trudeau and Jacques Chrétien. It was because of our Indian Act and our missing and murdered Indigenous women. We don't have the recognition that we deserve in our own school system. So can you imagine what it's going to be like when my students graduate and go off into the world if they don't know to respect a group of, or a culture that has been here since the beginning of first contact? Turtle Island is all of North America, and it was explored in the early 1600s, and it was taken over. And then essentially we were all just kind of shoved to uninhabitable pieces of land. You know that a reserve is just reserve land, and most of them are uninhabited pieces of land because they never thought that my culture would ever succeed in staying alive for this long. So when we have people that are racist like that, it's really, really hard to show them how amazing we can be, because we have such trauma and we have such sadness, and we have people that were part of the residential school system that are so broken, and they have children that see their parents broken or see their grandparents broken, and then it's just goes down the line. And that's kind of how our students are now. Why would you repair something when you don't even know where to go? So when we look at this, I guess when we look at racism, we see a First Nation person, and we always, and I say we, but it's not really me, but I know a lot of people in my classroom, they see a First Nation person and all of these words pop up, and because that's what they think of us. So when I say I'm First Nations to a person, I know that's what they're thinking in their head. And it's sad that they can't see beyond that. They can't see all of those things. So there's always trauma in everybody, and we always have to show kindness and be kind to one another. But it's really, really hard when nobody understands, or nobody has taken the time to delve super, super deep into the history of Canada and find out the things that you were not taught in school. But don't worry, because I'm teaching it to my students, and I am a whole slew of brand new teachers that are teaching the truth. We are teaching the truth and reconciliation, the 94 calls to action, which you guys are working on 57 right now. And that's what I'm a part of, which I'm so honored to be part of. We are working on learning about our residential schools, our missing and murdered individuals, our 60 scoop. My students are learning about the white paper. They're learning about the Indian Act. They're learning about pre-contact and how the First Nations were treated by the RCMP. That's what they're learning. And when my 11 and 12-year-olds graduate high school and they go off into the world, I have 28 students in this class that will tell one more person about all of the information they learned. And they'll tell somebody, you know what, you don't get to speak about First Nation and Métis and Inuit people like that. This is the reason why. Did you know? And then they'll give them information and historical contact. And then all of a sudden, that's another person that knows. And then that information will go to somebody else. So it's not really anybody's fault that they don't know. Trust me, it's not in the history books. I had to learn it myself. And I am now putting that forth to my students. And I am the only First Nation teacher at my school. And I'm teaching circles. I'm doing blanket exercises. I am teaching them about Chani Wenjack walk. I am teaching them about the secret path. Right now, I'm reading Indian Horse to my students. And then we're going to watch the movie. So like all of these things that are happening, my rules in my classroom are not rules. Their character. Are you showing love? Are you showing respect? It is my 7 grandfather teachings. I don't have rules in my classroom. It's what kind of character you are. So as long as we can have teachers that have that mentality, then we're going to be okay. And everybody's going to learn the truth, and they're going to be able to therefore teach everybody else. And I'm hoping that maybe in 25 to 30 years, it might be a little bit of a different atmosphere, and we might be okay with our justice system. And this restorative justice might even take a bigger role with not just our First Nation, Métis, and people. It might actually take a role with everybody else.
Jen, thank you very much. This has been quite impressive. I do know there's 2 other people at least that have some questions, if I can, keeping mindful of time here, folks. Tom and John Lamers, I think. Mr. Patterson, go ahead.
I'm not sure I want to follow that.
I know, it was such a great commentary, Jen.
I have more thoughts than questions. I guess what struck me through the presentation was where all of this, I mean, I agree with the principles of restorative justice. It's not just giving someone a second chance, but so my question was around where would it be useful for a municipality? I know that Canada, and I know in Canada, we've made an effort to make restorative justice referrals, certainly in youth criminal justice. I'm not sure if it's not just in youth criminal justice, but I know the legislation included criminal justice, so non-youth. And I'm assuming that it was not just in First Nation case. If you identify as a First Nation person, you get the right to go to referral. My understanding of the federal legislation was that anybody could be subject to. You're shaking your head. No?
No, unfortunately, it's not like that.
So it's just First Nation. That was my first question.
Please be advised that there are people that are allies for our First Nation and Métis and Inuit peoples. For example, Kayla is an ally. She can, if she chose, to self-identify as First Nation. She doesn't have to be born as a First Nations person to identify as it, right? My wife is identified as a First Nation person. She is not of First Nation descent, but she fully values and lives the First Nation way. And that's okay. So if Kayla was to go and commit a crime, she can self-identify as it, and she will be immediately put into that program. So I guess it's the way that you perceive yourself and how you choose what kind of way you want to be treated. Do you want to learn from it, or do you want to hide from it?
Yeah. No, well, I guess I guess my understanding was, and maybe it's not precisely restorative justice as we've talked about it this afternoon through you, but I thought there was legislation in Canada that was at least using the restorative justice principles. And some of the courts were taking advantage of it in terms of referrals. But you're saying only if you self-identify as First Nation.
If you self-identify as a First Nation, you're immediately put into the program. There is a
even if the victim doesn't want it? Isn't it a
well,
cooperative thing?
I mean, okay, so let's put it this way. If I've done something wrong, generally a victim wants to be whole. They want to hear that I was wrong. I am sorry. I will make it right. I don't think that there would be anybody other than maybe a sexually assaulted victim that wouldn't want to face a person that is readily available to admit their wrongs. I think it's really hard to explain because I'm like, the culture is accepting. The culture is easy to get along with, and we are able to, that's our first go-to, right? That's just what happens. You just make it right with the person. That's what we teach our students all the way up into high school. And then once they're kind of off in their own little world, then all of a sudden we don't want to take responsibility for what we do wrong, because what is our consequence, right? So if you have a person that self-identifies as First Nations, you're automatically put into the program. You could participate in it. I guess it might be available to you, but if you don't know what it is, then why would you be in it?
Well, I guess my question was, why aren't more referrals made to restorative justice? And I think I understood you saying, well, sometimes it's not available to most Canadians.
Yeah, it's definitely not. I know in Midland, it totally, like, there's a pamphlet that you're given with your client and you are good to go. Like, you can outsource anybody and make sure that you know. But in some areas where it's thousands of kilometers or away from a reserve, why would there be anybody in there to help? You know what I mean? Like, there's nobody in Tottenham, there's nobody in Bradford area, West Gwillimbury area. I know that for a fact because I was trying to get a person to talk to my students. There was nobody. I had to outsource to Barrie. And I think that's the unfortunate part, is that as much as we are trying to reconcile and work on things, we still really lack a lot of things that are available for our people. I guess the question is, is, would you, if you had done something wrong, be interested in doing that? And if everybody agreed that that was what they wanted, then we would probably see it more often, but nobody knows a lot about it, right? It's just not, nobody talks
Well,
about it.
I would, I'm just exercising some of my thoughts here. We don't often get to talk about something as enlightening as this in any subject, not just the council, in any place. I think it's more an initiative of the victim than the perpetrator.
No, it's
Because-
the perpetrator that has to
because-
make the contact.
Well, yes, but it's the issue. I thought you were going to say the block is why it's not being used more is because too many of us victims, let's say, would prefer a penalty as opposed to restorative justice.
But then how many of those victims don't even know that there's another option, right? Like if I'm a victim and I didn't even know there was an option to have my perpetrator look me in the eye and apologize and make it right, why would I choose that?
So you're saying it's just a lack of lack of information.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I will say this, and I would say it's also our society is going in the wrong direction in some things. And
Yeah.
so I think I'm safe in saying that there's more people looking for let's say a revenge, if you like, or an emphasis on how victimized they were,
Mhm.
than taking the more difficult step, perhaps initially, to restore not just the two people involved, the offender and the victim, but society. Like we're rebuilding society in a set of a fair society. If we're taking this step with restorative justice, I just don't see us ready to do it. I hope we are, but I don't see it.
You're right. However, how many victims just want to like scream at their perpetrator? How many victims want them to hear all of the unjust things that they did to them? There's your opportunity. There's your opportunity. You can scream, you can yell, you can cry, you can, other than touch them and physically harm them, you really can just bust out exactly how you feel. And then once it's all out, your perpetrator knows exactly how you feel. And then that victim doesn't get to walk around anymore and be like, oh, I'm so angry. I want to just tell them off. I want them to know what's going on. No, they just did it. And then it's almost like you're healed a little bit because you were heard. I guess that's the main thing, is that you're heard by the person that did you wrong. And you're proving why they did you wrong. And then it's up to them to make it right. Every victim, I would probably think, would love a moment with somebody that hurt them, right? Not to hurt them physically. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about to be able to express verbally how they hurt them. There's power in words. There's power in sitting in a circle and staring at the person that hurt you right in the eyes for moments, minutes, hours, if you want. There's power in that. And I think if more people knew about it, I think more people would take advantage of it. Plus, also think about it this way. How many people do you think are in a court system all day long? How many people do you think are running through a court system? Let's say 100 people a day, right? They go in, their court date gets pushed, or they just get, they get a small fine or whatever. You're pushing all of these people through in a day. Imagine what it would be like if you instead had a courtroom, you had 10 rooms. And every hour you put a new victim and a new perpetrator in there to talk. Just imagine that. Do you know how much faster that would go? You would start not needing those 10 rooms anymore. All you would need was just a big room with a whole bunch of chairs in it. Eventually it would come back to being just listening with your eyes, talking to each other, respecting each other. And then you can use the court system for when they reoffend and they haven't learned. But I bet you it won't happen like that anymore. They'll learn. There's power in words. There's power in eyes.
Thank you very much. Councillor Lamers, John, did you have one more thing you wanted to add? And
yeah, I think she just answered most of it through Tom's
she sure
question.
did.
I was just wondering, we have Indigenous people around here. How many of them got arrested, would be ashamed or afraid, or don't know that they can identify themselves in a courtroom?
I would suggest quite a few. Go ahead.
I would say anybody that isn't in the Georgian Bay area and anybody that isn't within like so many kilometers of a reserve would have no clue that you could just walk into a courtroom and say, listen, I'm First Nations and I would like to have some resources.
So we really need to educate some of these people.
Yes.
It's going to be a long process.
Yes, we do. And the problem with the way that this process is because the First Nations wanted to govern their own people. And when the Europeans came over and they started their own government, they actually removed that governance from the First Nation people. And that's why we are where we are, because we weren't able to keep that. So let's say I offended, my reserve would take me and deal with me myself, instead of putting me into the regular society court system, right? So instead of all of my First Nation fellow people that are in the court system right now, they would have been dealt with strictly by the reserve had we kept our own government system that was removed from us. So just think about that, because that's an interesting process.
It almost sounds like, I'm sorry, Councillor Deneen Phyllis. It almost sounds like Indigenous people should be identified prior to even entering the court system. I've been in court before and had to speak to the judge. It's really intimidating, extremely intimidating, even when you haven't done anything wrong. And yeah, it's too bad there couldn't be a way of identifying them prior to them actually even entering court. And I'm listening to it and it brings back memories of my mother dragging one of my brothers back to the store because he came home with something in his pocket and apologizing to the person that he's handing it back to, or taking the flowers back to the lady next door because he picked all her pretty flowers, and they never did it again. But I'm just listening to that. And it's too bad there wasn't some way of them being identified prior to them getting that far. And you talked a little bit about the seriousness of the crime. You said a sexual assault victim. That where is the line that is there a line that you would draw with the seriousness of a crime where you think that this circle would go? That's just a question I have. Thanks.
That's actually a really great question. I guess it really depends on the victim. I think it depends on how much they want to face the person that wronged them. If you're a strong person and you can look in the eyes of somebody who has hurt you, I don't think you would say no to that. I think you'd be like, yeah, you're in a protected area. You have police officers with you. You have people you trust. The whole point is that it's not supposed to get physical. The whole point is that you're supposed to listen. So I think it would be up to the victim, and it would be up to the perpetrator. They need to make the decision to, like, it would have to be simultaneous where they both agree to it.
Okay.
Right.
See, my problem is I'm thinking about You brought the part up. What if it's a child and an adult, and the adult wants to speak to the child, and the child just, I know there'd be somebody there to advocate for the child, but does the child have a choice?
Actually, that's a really great question. First you would start, and I've been in I facilitated a circle of a student under the age of 12, which students over the age of 12, they can be arrested. The community police officer can come and take care of them. But I've had students under the age of 12 where they need representation from somebody else. And I've done a restorative justice circle this morning with that. And the parents come. And the parents are there to support. I talk during it to introduce everybody, to tell them how the circle works. And then we just wait until somebody is ready to talk. I don't actually say to them, okay, child number one, it's your turn to talk, because maybe they're not ready. Maybe they don't even know how to start. Like, I can't give them a sheet of paper that says, okay, start with this and then do, because then that's not restorative. That's kind of like, I've pre-made it for them. That's not how it goes. And we would sit and we would wait, and 100% guaranteed, and this happened this morning, the parents are the ones that talk first. The parents are the ones that talk to each other about how they've wronged their child, how that parent has wronged their child. And then the children start talking to each other. I would assume that in a parent or a child versus adult, it would be the same. I would have the parents there, full support. I would invite anybody that would help influence that child, whether it be a mentor, a teacher, an aunt, an uncle, grandmother, those people that would kind of circle that child with love and respect to be in that circle. And that child doesn't have to talk. That child could listen to everybody talking. But the point is that that perpetrator now has to face not just the child, but the whole family, because they didn't just hurt the child, they hurt the family. And now you've got to answer to 8 people, right? And that's what family is. That's what a restorative justice is, a whole bunch of people coming together and making it right. If the child doesn't want to do it, that's okay. The parents can do it for them. They can advocate for them. And they can relay that information. I know of a friend that did it where they had the child sitting in another room and watching it on video. And then they were like, no, I want to talk to this person. And they just got all this courage, and they were so brave, and they went into the room and they faced them. And it wasn't until that child spoke that the person that wronged that child started crying. And crying is an emotion that not everybody has the ability to cry. But once you can make a person cry just by explaining your position and your feelings and your emotions and how they wronged you, you've broken that person and you've gotten just what you wanted, which was their compassion.
Jen, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
You've spent quite a bit of time with us here talking about a topic that's got great complexities and great simplicity at the same time. So we really appreciate you contributing to this, and I'm quite sure that our council has learned quite a bit this afternoon. We've had some great sessions here, and we appreciate you making the effort to join us, and thank you for sharing.
Thank you. It was so great to meet all of you.
You betcha. You take care and keep up the good work.
Thank you.
All right. And so, council, I'd like to go back to Kayla. Kayla has one other thing, I guess, or a couple other items on our agenda. Kayla, you've included some materials that council can have a look at. Do you want to just give us a brief on what they are and why they're important?
Yeah, actually, Cynthia did a really, really good job at describing it earlier on in this afternoon's session. Yep. So the book list that she spoke about, her slides, the racism scale, everything is attached to your agenda for your review afterwards. And as you continue your journey for the knowledge and the different perspectives that we're looking for here as we move forward towards truth and reconciliation. So thank you everybody for your participation in that.
Now, don't you go away, Kayla. Does any members of council have any questions to Kayla? And she spent an awful lot of time on this research. So now's your time. Anybody, any questions for Kayla? Go ahead. I knew Councillor McKechnie. I could count on you. Jump in there.
You can always count on me. No questions, just a comment. Great presentation, Kayla. We came into this, the idea of this workshop was to learn something, and I think we did. I think everybody learned something. So
Yes,
it was
sir.
great. I really appreciate it. So
I agree. Thank you.
Mr. Broderick.
Thank you, Your Worship. No question either. I just a comment. It was great presentation, and thank you so much for putting this together, Kayla.
Thank you.
Right on. Okay. If there's nothing further, I want to just thank you again, Kayla, and thank the entire clerk's department for assisting with this project. I know that they've given you a great deal of support in order to be able to do this, so good for them. Okay, thanks very much, Kayla. Thank you for all this work. I look forward to council considering some of this, as we will probably see a report or a recommendation once again in regards to the focus of an Indigenous land acknowledgement statement. All right, council, if there's nothing further, I'd like to go for the bylaw to confirm the proceedings and motion to adjourn. I do want to acknowledge that Deputy Mayor Burton sent me a message. He did have a previous engagement, had to leave just before 5 o'clock. So he stepped out of the meeting. Okay, at this time, recommendation be it resolved bylaw number 21115, being a bylaw to confirm the proceedings of the November 25, 2021 council meeting workshop, be presented over the first, second, and third time, finally passed on the 25th day of November 2021. Mover and seconder, Mr. Lamers and Mr. Broderick. I'll call the motion. All those in favor? And the bylaw carries. And motion to adjourn, unless there's something, anything from Madam Clerk or anybody from our staff. No, nothing. Okay. Everybody have a great weekend. We'll call the motion to adjourn. Recommendation be it resolved. Council meeting be adjourned at where are we at 5:17 p.m. Mover seconder, Janine seconded. Lamers, and thank you very much. All in favor. And the adjournment carries. I wish you all a very good evening.